The gaslight guttered low in a rented Melbourne cottage, and the summer air hung heavy with jasmine and dust. A constable knelt on the parlour floor, his lantern trembling above a patch of fresh cement. The trowel marks were still visible in the plaster, curved like small pale scars. Outside, cicadas sang in the eucalyptus, and a horse shifted in the lane. He struck the floor once, then again. The cement cracked, and the smell rose, sweet, wet, unmistakable. A woman's dark hair had been folded neatly against her cheek. Her wedding ring caught the lantern light. Somewhere in England, 4 small graves lay beneath another cottage floor, sealed the same way, by the same steady hand. And on a steamer bound for Sydney, that hand was writing letters again, in a neat, careful script. The quiet before the discovery. Good evening, and welcome. This is the Bedside Historian, and the night is quiet now. The world outside has grown small and soft. Wherever the listener rests tonight, in a warm bed by a window, or a chair beneath a lamp, or a room where the rain taps gently at the glass, a kind welcome is offered. Perhaps it is late where the listener sits, and the clock has already turned past midnight. Perhaps it is early morning, and the first pale light has not yet reached the sill. Whatever hour it is on that side of the night, let it be a gentle one. If the story to come brings comfort in its telling, a small kindness would help this quiet channel grow. A subscribe, a gentle press of the like, so that more sleepers may find these candle-lit histories in the dark. And now, softly, the world falls away. The room dims. The century turns backward. The year is 1891, and the summer is settling upon the colony of Victoria in the far south of the world. Melbourne in that December was a city of yellow light and long shadows. The heat had come early that year, dry and heavy, pressing against the bluestone curbs and the iron lace of the verandas. Along Burke Street, the horse cabs stood in a long, slow line, their drivers dozing on the boxes, hats tipped low against the sun. The wooden shop fronts of the drapers and the tobacconists were shuttered against the afternoon glare. In the arcades the gas jets hissed even in daylight, for the passages there were narrow and always dim. A ballad seller sang for a penny outside the post office. A boy in a canvas apron carried a tray of iced lemon drinks, 3p a glass, to the clerks who could spare the coin. The scent of eucalyptus drifted down from the parks, mixed with the sweeter smell of jasmine climbing over the garden fences of the wealthier streets. Beneath it all lay the older scent of horse dung and river mud, the constant perfume of every colonial city in that age. South of the river lay the quiet suburbs. The land there had once been swamp and scrub, then paddocks, then row after row of small brick cottages built in the boom years of the previous decade. Prahran had its shops and its music halls. St Kilda had its sea baths and its long timber pier. Between them lay Windsor, a modest place of red brick and slate roofs, of narrow lanes and small front gardens, where clerks and shopkeepers lived on wages of £2 a week and paid perhaps 10 shillings in rent. In Andrew Street the cottages stood close together, each with a low iron gate and a strip of sandy soil where a rose or two struggled against the summer. The pavement was patched with red gravel. A lamplighter came each evening with his long pole and lit the single gas lamp at the corner, though many families used only candles indoors, or a kerosene lantern set upon the kitchen table, for the mantle burners were dear to run. At number 57 the front room curtains had been drawn for weeks. This was not unusual in itself, for the sun-bleached fabric, quickly and thrifty tenants kept their parlours dim through the hot months. Yet the neighbours had noticed the silence. The cottage had been let in October to a well-dressed gentleman who called himself Mr. Druin, though some remembered a different name upon his card, and a young Englishwoman he introduced as his wife. She was slight and fair, with a soft Lancashire voice, and she wore a plain dark travelling gown when she first came down the lane with her carpet bag. She had smiled at the woman next door and asked, in her quiet way, where the nearest baker might be found. That had been shortly before Christmas. Since then no one had seen her. The gentleman had been seen. He came and went with a steady step, always in a good coat despite the heat, always in a stiff collar and a black felt hat, he carried parcels. He carried, one afternoon, a fresh bag of cement upon his shoulder from the ironmonger in Chapel Street, and a new bricklayer's trowel wrapped in brown paper. The grocer's boy who delivered a pound of tea and a tin of golden syrup on the 15th of December remembered him well, for the gentleman had answered the door only a crack, taken the parcel through the gap, and dropped a shilling into the boy's hand without a word. The boy had noticed the smell of fresh mortar drifting out from the passage. He had thought nothing of it. Men often patched their own hearths in those cottages, for the cheap bricks cracked in the summer heat, and a landlord would not send a mason for so small a matter. By the middle of January the gentleman too was gone. He had settled his rent with the agent in advance, tipped his hat, and departed on the morning train to Sydney with a single leather trunk. The cottage stood empty for a fortnight. Then, in the first week of February, a new tenant arrived. His name was Mr. Stamford, and he was a working man with a wife and a small child. He had taken the lease at 11 shillings the week, unfurnished, and he was pleased with the arrangement, for the parlour was of a good size, and the kitchen had a decent range with a copper boiler for the washing. His wife came the next day with a cart of their possessions, a pine table, 4 rush-bottom chairs, a horsehair sofa with 1 broken caster, a china jug and basin, a wicker cradle for the child. She spread a rag rug upon the parlour boards and hung a coloured print of Her Majesty above the mantel. She lit a small fire in the range and boiled a kettle for tea. That first evening she noticed the smell. It was faint at first, and she could not place it. She thought perhaps a rat had died beneath the boards, for the cottages of Windsor were plagued by rats in that summer, and every household kept a terrier or a trap or a saucer of poisoned meal beside the copper. She swept the parlour, threw open the sash windows, and hung a bunch of dried lavender from a hook by the door. The smell remained. Her husband, coming home from the yard where he worked as a wheelwright's man for £1.15 a week, sniffed at the air and frowned. He too suspected a rat, and he lifted the boards in the pantry and looked beneath. He found nothing. That night the child cried in the cradle, and the wife sat up in the dark and pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, for the smell had grown stronger in the still air. It seemed to come from the fireplace in the second bedroom, the small room at the back where they had not yet set a bed. By the third day the smell was unbearable. The lavender did nothing. The open windows did nothing. The neighbours over the fence had begun to smell it too, and Mrs. Hill, who kept the cottage at number 59, came around with her hand pressed to her face and asked, with the plain frankness of a woman who had raised 6 children in that lane, whether something had crawled into the walls and died. Mr. Stamford agreed that something had. He walked to the agent's office in Chapel Street that afternoon and made his complaint. The agent, a man named Mr. Connop, was apologetic. He said he would send a man to look. He said such things happened in the summer. He said perhaps the drains beneath the kitchen had cracked in the heat. The man he sent was a plumber called Mr. Hetherington, who arrived on the morning of the 3rd of March with a canvas bag of tools and a piece of tarred rope for the drain traps. He had lifted many a board in his working life, and had smelled many an unpleasant thing beneath them. He walked through the parlour, sniffed at the pantry, then went to the small back bedroom and knelt upon the boards before the fireplace. He knew at once that the smell was not from a drain. Drains carried a sour, sharp odour. This was sweeter, thicker, older. It clung to the roof of the mouth. He looked at the hearthstone before him and saw at once that the mortar there was fresh, not weeks fresh, but months fresh, still a little paler than the older grout around it, still bearing the faint curved marks of a trowel drawn by a careful hand. He rose from his knees and went out to the lane and stood in the sun and thought for a long moment. Then he walked to the police station in High Street. The constable on duty that afternoon was a young man named Fryer, though the case would soon pass through the hands of many older heads. He listened to the plumber's account, wrote it in his book with a steel-nibbed pen, and sent word to Sergeant Considine at the Prahran station. The sergeant was a steady, black-moustached man of some 20 years in the force, who had seen most of what a colonial city could offer a policeman, and expected no further surprises from it. He came down Andrew Street in the late afternoon, his tunic buttoned to the collar despite the heat, his boots ringing on the gravel path. He touched his cap to Mrs. Stamford at the door, spoke a few gentle words to the frightened child, and asked to be shown the room. He stood in the small back bedroom for some minutes without speaking. The window looked out upon a scrap of yard where a rusted washing line sagged between two posts. A single geranium bloomed in a pot upon the sill. The air was thick and heavy, and the flies had begun to gather at the fresh mortar. The sergeant knelt as the plumber had knelt, and traced the trowel marks with the tip of his finger. He rose and asked for a pick and a hammer and a lantern, and for the plumber to return with him at 8 o'clock that evening, when the light would be gone and the neighbours less inclined to watch over the fence. The evening was still and warm. The sun set behind the roofs of the terraces along Chapel Street, and the sky turned the colour of a bruised peach. A cart went by carrying watermelons from the market gardens along the Yarra. Somewhere a piano was being played in a front parlour, a slow music hall tune that drifted through the open windows. In the cottage at number 57, the shutters were closed and the door was bolted. Sergeant Considine had brought with him another constable, a solid older man named Causey, and the plumber Hetherington had returned with his pick and his bag. A single kerosene lantern was set upon the mantel. The wick smoked a little, and the flame threw long shadows against the papered walls. The mantelpiece above the hearth was of painted pine, and beneath it the hearthstone was a slab of bluestone about 3 feet across. Around the stone the fresh mortar ran in a neat pale band. Constable Causey struck the mortar with the pick. The dry summer had hardened it, and it did not yield easily. He struck again, and a piece the size of a shilling fell away. The smell that came out of the small opening was such that the plumber turned his face to the wall and pressed his sleeve against his mouth. The sergeant did not move. He set the lantern closer, and the yellow light spilled into the crack, and he saw within it the pale curve of a shoulder, wrapped in a scrap of dark cloth. He straightened slowly and stood in the flickering light with his hands behind his back, and he said to the men with him, in a low voice, that they would need to send for the coroner. The pick worked on. Piece by piece the mortar came away, and then the hearthstone was lifted and set aside upon the parlour floor. Beneath it a shallow pit had been dug into the earth beneath the boards, no more than 18 inches deep, and lined with a layer of fresh cement upon the sides. Within the pit lay the body of a young woman. Her hair was dark and had been folded neatly against her cheek. She wore a nightdress of white cambric, edged with a thin lace. Upon her finger was a plain gold wedding band. Her small brown boots had been placed beside her, laces tied together in a neat bow. A patterned shawl of grey and rose wool had been drawn across her face, as though by someone who did not wish to look upon it after the work was done. Sergeant Considine took off his cap. He held it against his breast for a long moment in the quiet of that small room, while the lantern hissed upon the mantel and the flies gathered in the warm air. He did not speak. Outside, the piano in the neighbouring cottage was still playing, softer now, the tune trailing off toward its close. A cab went by in the lane, the wheels crunching upon the gravel. The child in the front parlour had at last fallen asleep against its mother's shoulder. The night was very still. That was how the world first learned of the cottage in Andrew Street. In the days to come the newspapers would print her likeness, and the trowel marks upon the mortar, and the address of the small brick house where the smell had risen through the summer heat. They would tell how the sergeant had bent his head beside the shallow grave, and how a young wife had lain beneath a hearth she had helped to sweep. They would tell of the gentleman in the black felt hat, and the parcels of cement, and the morning train to Sydney. They would begin to ask who he had been, and where he had gone, and whether he had done such a thing before. And far away, in a Lancashire village of stone cottages and slow canals, another landlord would soon walk into another empty house, and lift another hearthstone, and find beneath it what had been sealed there in the summer before last. But that lay ahead, in the slow uncovering to come. For now, in the warm dark of that Melbourne evening, only the lantern burned, and the sergeant stood bareheaded in the small back room, and the century turned quietly upon its hinge. A boy from Ashby-de-la-Zouch. The lantern in that Melbourne room burned down toward its wick, and the century turned quietly backward. 40 years fell away like leaves. The wide, dry southern city grew small and vanished into the sea. In its place rose a green and misted country, older and colder, of hedgerows and slow smoke and small stone towns. This is Leicestershire in the middle years of Queen Victoria's reign, and the town is Ashby-de-la-Zouch. It stood in the low green heart of England, ringed by pasture and coal country. The market square was cobbled and worn smooth by cartwheels. A ruined castle lay at the edge of the town, its broken tower open to the sky, and children played among the fallen stones on summer evenings. The high street was narrow, lined with brick and timber houses whose upper stories leaned a little toward each other, as though sharing an old secret. There was a corn exchange with a tall clock, and a coaching inn called the Queen's Head, and a small draper's shop where a length of good calico could be had for 4pence the yard. The air smelled of horse and hay and the sweet peat smoke that drifted from the cottage chimneys. In the distance, beyond the hedges, the pit wheels of the collieries turned slowly against the sky. Into that town, on the 30th of July in the year 1853, a boy was born to a poor family in a small brick cottage off the Nottingham Road. His name was set down in the parish book as Frederick Bailey Deeming. His father was Thomas Deeming, a tinsmith who mended pots and pans and kettles for the country folk, and who kept a small forge behind the cottage with a leather bellows and a battered anvil. His mother was Anne Bailey Deeming, a slight fair woman with quiet hands and a gentle voice. She had married Thomas at the parish church some 15 years before, and she had already borne him 6 children by the time young Frederick came. He was the 7th, and he was the last. The cottage was 2 rooms below and 2 rooms above, with a scullery lean-to at the back and a small yard beyond. The floors were of stone flags in the kitchen and bare pine boards in the rooms above. A cast-iron range stood against the kitchen wall, and beside it a shallow copper for the washing. A single deal table filled the middle of the room, scrubbed white with sand each Saturday by Anne's careful hand. The chairs were rush-bottomed. A blue and white jug stood upon the dresser, and a row of pewter plates behind it, and a small print of Her Majesty and Prince Albert hung above the door. In the corner, upon a shelf of dark oak, lay the family Bible in its worn leather binding, with the names of every Deeming child written inside the front board, in Anne's careful hand. Thomas Deeming was a hard man. He had been born poor, and he had lived poor, and the years of bending over an anvil had bent his temper as well. He drank ale at the Queen's Head on Saturday nights, and he came home with a heavy step and a heavier hand. He beat his sons when the work was slow and the coin was thin. He beat his daughters less, though he raised his voice to them often. He was not, for his time and his place, an unusual father. Many a Leicestershire tinker did the same. But there was in him a coldness that even the neighbours remarked upon, and a strange fixed stare that came upon him when he had been drinking, and a way of falling into silences that lasted for days. His eldest son, Alfred, would later say that their father was not right in his head, and that the trouble was in the blood. Anne was a different matter. She was the daughter of a small farmer from over toward Colville, and she had been taught to read and to write in the village dame school. She had a soft voice and a soft laugh, and she loved her children with a quiet, steady love that did not falter, even when the coin was short and the pantry was bare. She kept the cottage clean. She sewed the boys' shirts by candlelight when the day's work was done. She baked oat bread on the range and stirred bacon fat into the pot of thin barley broth that fed them through the winter. She sang to them the old ballads of the shires, the lark in the morning, the barley mow, come, all ye bold ploughmen. When Frederick was very small, she would set him upon her knee before the fire and stroke his hair and tell him that he was her own dear boy and that he must always try to be a good one. He would remember her voice all his life. Even at the very end, when he stood in a cold stone cell in Melbourne with the noose one day away, he would say of her, quietly and without shame, that she was the sweetest woman that ever lived. It was one of the few true things he ever spoke. The boy was not like his brothers. From the first, he was a strange child. He was small for his age, thin in the shoulder, with pale hair and eyes of a light, restless blue. He did not sit still. He could not bear a shut door. He would run out into the lane at all hours, in his nightshirt, in the rain, to chase a dog or watch the coaches pass. He talked too much, and too loudly, and to himself. He would fly into rages over small things, a crust of bread taken from his plate, a wooden top lost in the yard, and then, an hour later, laugh and sing and clap his hands as though nothing had passed. He had, from a very early age, the fits. They came without warning. He would fall to the flagstones with his eyes rolled back and his small body shaking, and Anne would kneel beside him with a folded cloth pressed between his teeth, and Thomas would stand in the doorway with his arms crossed and his face very still, and say nothing. The village doctor was called once, at the cost of 1 shilling and 6pence that the family could not spare. He shook his head over the boy, and murmured of a weakness in the brain, and prescribed a spoonful of laudanum at bedtime, and took his fee, and went away. The other children of Ashby learned quickly to keep their distance from young Fred. In the schoolyard behind the National School, where the boys played at marbles and hoops, he was a boy alone. He would come up to a group of them with his bright, wild eyes and say something that made no sense, and then laugh very hard at his own joke, and the others would edge away. He picked fights he could not win. He stole small things, a slate pencil, a knot of ribbon, a boiled sweet from a stall on market day, not because he wanted them, but because he could not seem to stop his hands. The schoolmaster, a stern grey man named Mr. Whittle, caned him often for lying, for the boy would tell tales so brazen and so easily disproved that even the youngest child in the room would laugh at them. He said he had seen a lion in the churchyard. He said his father had been to America. He said an angel had come down and spoken to him in the lane. He said these things not once but many times, and he seemed, in the moment of telling them, to believe every word. The neighbours in the row of cottages had a name for him. They called him Mad Fred. They did not say it unkindly, on the whole. In those days, a boy who was strange in his head was not shunned as he might be in later years. He was simply Mad Fred, the tinker's youngest, and the women at the pump would shake their heads over him and say that Anne Deeming had trouble in that one. Some said the fits had come from Thomas's side, for a cousin of his in Derbyshire had gone the same way. Some said it was the drink and the beatings. Some said it was the will of God, and there was no more to be said than that. The years went on. The boy grew, though he never grew tall. By the age of 10 he could be sent with a small basket down the high street to fetch a loaf and a pat of butter, and he would come back with the change knotted in a rag, though sometimes he would come back without the change at all, and could give no clear account of where it had gone. He was set to help his father at the forge. He was quick with his hands, and he had a good eye for the shape of a mended kettle, and Thomas found, to his surprise, that the strange boy could solder a seam as neat as any journeyman. When he chose to work, he worked well, but he did not often choose. He would wander off in the middle of a task, out into the lane, and be found an hour later sitting on a milestone by the Nottingham Road, watching the coaches pass and talking softly to himself. He was sent to Sunday school at the Baptist chapel. Anne was a devout woman, and she wished her boys to know their scripture. Frederick sat in the plain-scrubbed room with the other children and learned his verses by heart, and he learned them very well, for his memory was quick when he cared to use it. He could recite whole psalms without a slip. He liked especially the darker chapters, the plagues of Egypt and the fall of Babylon, and he would repeat them at home in a low sing-song voice, while he polished a copper pan for his mother at the kitchen table. Anne would smile at him from across the room and say that he had a gift for the word of God. The chapel elder was less certain. He thought there was something in the boy's manner, when he spoke of judgment and of fire, that was not quite the same as in the other children. Winters in Ashby were long and grey. Snow fell upon the market square, and the cottage windows were fringed with frost, and the coal was dear at 10 shillings the ton, and the family burned only what they must. Frederick would huddle by the range with a shawl of his mother's about his shoulders and watch the flames, and Anne would sit at the deal table with her needle and her thread, and mend the elbows of his brother's jackets by candlelight. On such nights the small cottage was almost peaceful. Thomas would be at the Queen's Head or asleep in the chair by the fire, and the older children were out at their work or their courting, and only Anne and her strange youngest boy remained in the warm, quiet room. She would ask him what he had done that day. He would tell her, and sometimes it was true, and sometimes it was a wild story of dragons and ships and hidden gold. She would nod as though she believed him. She would stroke his pale hair. She would say softly, "Freddie, my Freddie, thou must try to be good." He was 15 when she took ill. It was a winter fever, of the kind that carried off many a woman of that country in that century. She lay in the small upper room in the iron bedstead, with a patched quilt drawn to her chin, and the doctor came again and shook his head as he had shaken it over the boy, and prescribed a mustard poultice and a draught of laudanum, and took his shilling and went away. She lingered for some weeks. Frederick sat beside her in the failing afternoons, when the light through the small window turned the colour of pewter, and she held his hand in her thin, cool one, and told him again to be a good boy, and to say his prayers, and to keep clear of the drink and the bad company. He nodded. He cried into the quilt. He was still a small, thin boy, and his fits had grown worse in that year, and he did not know how he was to live in the cottage without her voice. She died on a grey morning in the early spring. The bell of the parish church tolled for her at 11 o'clock, and the neighbours came to the door with small offerings, a loaf of bread, a jar of honey, a bunch of the first snowdrops from the churchyard wall. Thomas stood by the coffin in his one black coat and said very little. He drank that night at the Queen's Head until he could no longer stand. Frederick sat alone in the cold parlour beside the small pine box in which his mother lay, and he stared at her folded hands with their plain gold ring, and something in him closed like a door. After the funeral, the cottage grew a stranger place. The older sisters had married and gone. The brothers were away at their trades, one apprenticed to a farrier in Loughborough, one gone for a soldier, one working the pit at Moira. Thomas turned harder without Anne to soften him, and the beatings grew worse and the silences longer. Frederick worked at the forge when he was made to, and ran away when he was not. He was seen upon the road to Leicester, then upon the road to Nottingham, then coming home after 3 days with no clear account of where he had been. He began to steal in earnest, a shilling from a shop till, a horse blanket from a cart, a silver spoon from a lodging-house. He was caught once and beaten by a farmer with a length of harness leather. He was caught again and taken before the magistrate, who bound him over and warned Thomas that the boy was on a road that led to the Gale. By the time he was 16, the fits had begun to come with a new violence. His speech had grown wilder. He would laugh in the middle of the street for no reason that anyone could see. He would boast to strangers of fortunes he did not have, of ships he had sailed in, of ladies who had loved him. In the mirror above the kitchen dresser he would practice a new signature, over and over, in Anne's old inkwell. Sometimes it was his own name. Sometimes it was another. He was rehearsing already, though he did not yet know for what. One morning in the late summer he was gone. He had left in the night, with a bundle over his shoulder and a stolen half-sovereign in his pocket, and he did not turn back at the milestone or at the ruined castle, or at the parish church where his mother lay in the small green plot beneath a plain stone. He walked south through the hedgerows, through the small quiet towns of the shires, toward the coast and the smell of tar and salt and the great forest of masts he had heard of but never seen. Ashby-de-la-Zouch closed its market square behind him. The forge cooled, the cottage grew still, and the strange boy that the neighbours had called Mad Fred passed out of the town into a wider and darker world, carrying with him the memory of a soft voice by the fire, and something else, sealed already in the quiet place where his mother's death had shut its door. The sea and the stolen name. The road south from Ashby was long and dusty in that summer. The boy walked with his bundle upon his shoulder, and the stolen half-sovereign warm against his ribs. He slept in hedges. He drank from the horse troughs at wayside inns. He begged a crust here and a bowl of thin broth there, and he told the women who fed him wild, bright tales of an uncle at sea who had sent for him. Some believed him, some did not. It did not matter. By the end of the second week he had reached the great port of Liverpool, and the smell of the salt and the tar and the coal smoke had come up to meet him like a strange new music. Liverpool in that year was one of the great gates of the world. The Mersey ran wide and grey between the stone quays, and upon its water lay a forest of masts and funnels so thick that a man could scarcely see the far bank between them. Steamers of the White Star Line and the Cunard Line lay at the landing stage. Sailing barks from the Baltic unloaded their pine deals upon the timber wharves. Coasters from Ireland brought their sacks of oats and their bundles of linen. Along the docks the crowds moved in a slow, constant tide, dockers in canvas trousers, sailors in blue jerseys, emigrant families with their bundles tied in coloured shawls, clerks in stiff collars, women selling hot pies at a penny each from tin trays slung about their necks. The taverns of Paradise Street were open from 6 in the morning, and the smell of stale ale and pickled herring drifted out of every door. The boy stood upon the landing stage with his mouth open. He had never seen such a place. He watched a great foremaster being warped in from the river, her yards squared and her paint fresh, and he decided in that moment what he would be. He would be a sailor. He would cross the sea and come back a gentleman, with a gold watch chain across his waistcoat and a Spanish shawl for a wife he did not yet have. The dream came to him whole and shining, in the way that dreams come to boys who have nothing, and he held it against his chest as he walked down the quay toward the shipping offices. He signed his first indenture at the office of a small firm off Water Street. The clerk who took his mark was tired and did not look closely at the boy before him. Frederick gave his age as 17, though he was barely 16. He gave his name plainly as Frederick Deeming, for he had not yet learned the trick of other names, and he set his shaky signature upon the paper for the sum of £1 5 the month, all found. He was to sail as an apprentice steward aboard a barque bound for Calcutta with a mixed cargo of Manchester cottons and Sheffield hardware. He was given a canvas kit bag, a suit of dungarees, a tin plate and a tin mug and a horn spoon, and a berth in the forecastle upon a straw palliasse that smelled of tar and old sweat. The voyage out was long and hard. The Bay of Biscay met them with a gale that laid the barque upon her beam ends for 2 days and a night. The boy was sick as only a first voyager can be sick, and he lay in his bunk with his face against the damp planks and prayed in the words of the psalms his mother had taught him. When the gale passed and the sun came out over a green heaving sea, he crawled up on deck and stood by the rail and watched the flying fish rise from the swell in silver showers. Something in him steadied. He learned to hand a rope. He learned to scrub a deck with holystone and sand until it shone. He learned to polish the brass of the captain's cabin until his own face looked back at him from the lamp. And he learned, slowly, that the sea did not care who his father had been, or that he had been called Mad Fred in the schoolyard, or that his mother lay in a small green plot in Leicestershire beneath a plain stone. At Calcutta he saw for the first time the strange bright colours of the east. The river was thick with country boats. The heat pressed down like a hand upon the shoulders. In the bazaars off the Charinghe he watched a snake charmer coax a hooded cobra from a wicker basket, and he ate a plate of curried rice for a penny at a stall, and he stared at the pale English ladies riding in their carriages behind turbaned drivers with the same fixed hunger with which he had once stared at the shop windows of Ashby Market Square. He was ashore for 4 days. On the 3rd night he was drunk in a sailor's grog shop near the Ghats, and he told a red-faced Yorkshireman at the next table that he was the son of a Nottinghamshire baronet who had run away for love. The Yorkshireman laughed and stood him another glass. The boy laughed too. He was learning already how easy the lie was, and how warmly it was received when it was well told. He came home to Liverpool that winter with £3 and 8 shillings in his pocket, and a small brass Buddha he had bought for 6pence in the bazaar, and a fever that laid him up for a fortnight in a lodging-house off Scotland Road. When he was well he signed again, this time on a steamer bound for the Cape. So began the years of his wandering. From the age of 16 to the age of 28 he was seldom long upon the land. He shipped as steward, as pantryman, as assistant cook. He crossed the Atlantic in a bark carrying salt cod to Rio. He sailed round the Horn in a four-masted iron ship called the County of Peebles, in weather that stripped the paint from her plates and drove 3 men aloft to their deaths. He crossed the Indian Ocean by the Cape of Good Hope, and he crossed the Pacific by the Sandwich Islands, and he set his foot upon the wharves of Sydney and Melbourne and Cape Town and Bombay and Aden and Colombo. He came to know the smell of every port, the sandalwood smoke of Ceylon, the coal dust of Cardiff, the hot bread of Marseille, the salt fish of Newfoundland, and he came to know, too, the taverns and the lodging-houses and the dockside chapels and the small back rooms where a man could buy anything he pleased for a shilling or two. Somewhere in those years he lost the last of what had been his. He lost the plain Baptist prayers of the chapel in Ashby. He lost the small brass Buddha, pawned in a shop off the Ratcliffe Highway for the price of a bottle of rum. He lost the shaky signature that had said Frederick Deeming upon his first indenture. In its place he learned a new hand, quick and neat and slanting, that could shape any name he chose. He learned to write it on the flyleaf of a Bible he did not open. He learned to write it in the ledger of a boarding house. He learned to write it upon a letter of reference in the name of a captain who had never heard of him, upon paper he had bought in a stationer's shop in Cape Town for 3d the sheet, sealed with a wafer of red wax that he pressed with the back of a shilling. The first of the false names came to him in Sydney when he was 20. He had missed his ship. He had spent his pay in a public house in the rocks, upon rum, and upon a dark-eyed girl who took his money and closed the door of a small upstairs room behind her. When he woke, the ship was gone. He had no papers and no berth and no coin. He walked the length of Circular Quay in the hot morning, and he watched the pilot boats going out to the heads, and he thought very hard. Then he went into a shipping office and gave his name as Harry Lawson, and he said he had lost his papers in a fire at his lodgings, and he produced a folded letter written in a neat slanting hand and signed by a Captain Whitcomb of the bark Marion, whom he had heard of once in a dockside tavern. The clerk read the letter. The clerk shrugged. The clerk signed him on as steward aboard a colonial coaster bound for Newcastle in New South Wales at £2 the month. And Harry Lawson walked out of the office into the bright Sydney morning as easily as Frederick Deeming had walked in. After that the names came often, and he wore them as a man might wear borrowed coats. He was Harry Lawson in Sydney. He was Baron Swanston in Adelaide. He was Charles Deeming in Aden, and Lord Dunn in Cape Town, and Mr. Ward at a lodging-house in the Cape Flats where he stayed for 6 weeks and left without paying. He learned to change his manner as he changed the name. As Harry Lawson he was rough and quick, a sailor with a laugh and a wink for the barmaid. As Baron Swanston he was cool and slow, a gentleman with a soft London vowel and a card printed at his own expense at a printer's shop in Little Collins Street. As Lord Dunn he wore a monocle upon a black ribbon and spoke of a family estate in Warwickshire. He believed in each of them, in the moment of speaking, with the same easy faith he had once had for the lions in the churchyard and the angels in the lane. The old fits still came, though less often now. He had learned to hide them. When he felt one coming he would rise from a tavern table and go quickly out into a lane and lean against a wall until the shaking passed. Then he would return smiling and order another glass, and no one was the wiser. Women came with the names. Along every waterfront he found them, a serving girl in a Cape Town chop house, a widow who kept a lodging in Port Elizabeth, a farmer's daughter who was in town for the market at Adelaide. He wooed them beneath the flicker of the dockside lamps, in small parlours smelling of camphor and lavender, upon benches in park gardens where the frangipani bloomed. He brought them a paper twist of sugared almonds for 6d. He brought them a folded copy of a hymn set to a popular air. He spoke to them of the fortune he had left behind in England, and the small house he would one day take in a quiet lane by the sea. Some believed him for a night. Some believed him for a month. 1 or 2 believed him long enough to give him what small savings they had in a tin box beneath the bed, and to wake one morning and find the tin box empty and the gentleman gone, and only a single card upon the washstand bearing a name that had never been his. He was not, in those years, a violent man. He was a thief and a liar and a breaker of promises, and he was arrested more than once for small frauds and small debts, and he passed a short spell in Sydney Gaol for the theft of a watch chain from a shipmate. But he had not yet, so far as any record shows, laid a hand in anger upon a woman. That would come. In the shape of him it was already gathering, in the cold flat place behind his eyes that had opened on the day his mother died, and had never quite closed again. But for now he was only Fred or Harry or the Baron or his lordship, a small pale man with restless blue eyes and a neat slanting hand and a soft plausible voice, drifting from port to port beneath the wide southern stars. In the autumn of 1881 he came ashore at Sydney once more, from a steamer out of Fremantle, upon which he had worked his passage as pantryman. He had a little money and a new suit of clothes bought upon credit in a slop shop off George Street. He had a letter of reference, in his own neat hand, from a captain who did not exist. And he had, that season, taken it into his head that a wandering man might do well to have a wife. A wife was respectable. A wife softened the eye of a landlord and the tongue of a police sergeant. A wife could be shown when needed and left behind when needed. He walked out one Sunday evening from his lodging in Sussex Street, in his new suit and his second-hand hat, and he made his way toward a small chapel in the suburbs where he had been told there was singing after the service, and tea and cake for a penny in the schoolroom next door. He did not yet know her name. He did not yet know that she would follow him for a decade across 3 continents, and bear him 4 small children, and lie at last beneath a Lancashire kitchen floor with the same patient endurance with which she had lived. He knew only that the evening was mild, and that the gaslight was warm upon the chapel steps, and that a young woman in a plain grey dress was standing there with a hymn book in her folded hands, watching the lamps come on along the street. He crossed the road toward her. He raised his hat. He gave her his name, one of them, and asked whether she would care to walk a little way in the cool air. She looked at him for a long moment in the yellow gaslight. Then she smiled a small, quiet smile, and she said that she would. Marie and the 4 small shadows. Her name was Marie James, and she was 23 years old that Sydney autumn. She had come out to the colony from Birkenhead in Cheshire as a girl of 15, in the steerage of an emigrant ship, with her widowed aunt and a small tin trunk containing 2 cotton dresses, a Bible, and a lock of her mother's hair sewn into a scrap of black silk. She worked now as a general servant in the house of a wine merchant in Balmain, for the sum of £12 the year and her keep. She rose at 5:30 to lay the fires. She scrubbed the front steps with a hearthstone and a pail of hot water. She served the family their mutton and their boiled potatoes and their milk pudding, and she washed the plates in a stone sink at the back of the scullery, and she went to her small bed above the pantry at 10 o'clock, with her hands red and her back sore. On her one free Sunday in the month she walked down to the small Wesleyan chapel by the ferry landing, and she sat in the plain pine pew and sang the hymns in a soft, clear voice, and she thought sometimes of her mother's grave in the Birkenhead churchyard, and sometimes of nothing at all. She was a slight young woman with pale brown hair drawn back in a plain knot, and grey eyes that seemed always a little tired, and small quiet hands that were seldom still. She was not pretty in the way that turns a head in the street. She was, as the country people of her childhood would have said, comely and clean and kind. She had never walked out with a young man. Her aunt had died 2 winters before of a lung complaint, and Marie had been alone in the colony since, without kin and without prospect, saving her pennies in a stocking beneath her bed toward a passage home that she knew, in her heart, she would never take. That was the young woman who stood upon the chapel steps that evening in the gaslight, with a hymn book folded in her hands, when a small, pale gentleman in a new suit crossed the road toward her and raised his hat. He gave his name that night as Frederick Lawson, for he was still uncertain whether Harry might yet catch up with him from a small matter of debt in Newcastle. He said he was newly ashore from a long voyage, and lately come into a small inheritance from an uncle in England, and looking about him for a quiet lodging in a respectable street. He said it all in his soft, plausible voice, with his hat held against his chest and his blue eyes bright upon her face, and Marie listened to him in the yellow gaslight and did not know what to say. No man had ever spoken to her so before. When at last he asked whether she would walk a little way toward the ferry, she nodded, and she walked beside him along the quiet street, and she felt her heart beating in a strange new way beneath the plain grey dress. He courted her through that spring and summer. He came each Sunday evening to the corner of the wine merchant's street, and he waited beneath the street lamp with a small paper twist of sugared almonds in his coat pocket. He walked her down to the harbour and along the paths of the botanic gardens, where the frangipani was in bloom and the fruit bats hung in the great fig trees like folded umbrellas. He bought her a cup of tea for 2p at a stall on the wharf. He read her a little poem he said he had written for her, though it was in truth a stanza he had copied from a book he had seen in a shop window. He spoke of a small cottage they would take together by the sea, with a garden of roses and a canary in a wicker cage. Marie listened, and she believed him, for she had nothing else to believe in, and because he was gentle in his voice, and never once raised his hand or his tone, and because when the fits came upon him, he had learned to hide them, and she never saw one in all that courting time. They were married in the parish church at St. James in the early spring of 1881, upon a warm, bright morning with the jacarandas already in flower along the streets. He wore his new suit. She wore her plain grey travelling dress with a small posy of white daisies pinned at her breast, for they could not afford a proper gown. 2 witnesses were brought in from the vestry, a churchwarden and his wife, who had never seen the couple before that hour, and who signed the book for a shilling each. The register was filled out in his neat, slanting hand. He set down his name, on this occasion, as Frederick Bailey Deeming, ship's steward, for he had decided that day, quietly and without telling her, to be himself again. Marie set down her own name in a small, careful schoolgirl's hand. She was Marie Deeming now. She did not know what the name would come to mean. They took a lodging in a small brick terrace in Balmain, at 8 shillings the week, with a shared privy in the yard and a copper in the wash-house at the back. She left the wine merchant's service. She scrubbed her own step now, in the early morning, with the same hearthstone and pail. She hung his shirts upon the line strung between the fence and the lean-to, and she watched them blow white in the harbour wind. In the evenings she darned his stockings by the light of a single tallow candle upon the deal table, and she listened to him talk of the fortunes they would make. He was full of schemes in those first months. He would go up country and become a station overseer. He would take a shop in George Street and sell ship's chandlery. He would sail again as second officer upon a good clean steamer, and come home with £50 in his pocket. He talked of these things while she darned. She nodded, and she smiled, and she asked no hard questions, for she had learned in service not to ask hard questions of the master of the house. The first child came before the year was out. It was a girl, and they baptized her Bertha at the Wesleyan chapel by the ferry, on a hot February morning with the flies thick at the window. Marie held the small warm bundle at the font, and she felt something open in her chest that she had not known was closed. Frederick stood beside her in his one good coat. He held the child afterward upon his knee, in the plain pine parlour of the chapel house, and he pressed his lips to the pale down of her hair, and he said, in his soft voice, that she would be a lady one day, and would ride in her own carriage. Marie watched him, and for a little while she was almost happy. But the money went. It went in ways she could not follow. He was seldom at his ship. He was seldom at any work at all for long together. He came home late from Sussex Street, with his breath thick with brandy and small parcels under his arm that he could not have paid for from his purse. He brought her a Paisley shawl one week, and a silver-plated teapot the next, and a set of 6 bone-handled knives the week after, and he laid them upon the deal table and watched her face and waited for her to smile. She smiled, because he wished it, but she was afraid. She began to hear the knock of the landlord at the door on quarter day. She began to see the small folded notes upon the mantelpiece from a Mr. Solomon in Sussex Street, and from a Mr. Isaacs in George Street, and from a tailor in Pitt Street whom Frederick had told her only that morning was an old friend from the sea. They left Sydney in the night. He came home one evening in a great hurry, with a handsome cab waiting at the door, and he said that he had taken a fine position at Melbourne, and that they must be gone before the morning. She packed what she could into 2 carpet bags, the child's clothes, her own 2 dresses, the Bible, the lock of her mother's hair in the scrap of black silk. She left behind the paisley shawl and the silver-plated teapot and the 6 bone-handled knives, for they were not, she suspected, quite their own. The cab took them down to the wharves, and they went aboard a coastal steamer for Melbourne, with a single trunk between them, and she stood at the rail as the lights of Sydney fell away, and she held the baby against her shoulder, and she did not cry, though the tears came very close. So began the pattern of her life. In the 10 years that followed, she was to pack those 2 carpet bags more times than she could easily count. Melbourne was the first stage, then Adelaide, then a small brick cottage in a lane at Port Adelaide where the second child came, a boy they called Sydney, born on a stifling January night with the north wind carrying the smell of the mallee scrub across the salt flats. Then Rockhampton, where Frederick was gaoled 6 weeks for a fraud upon a jeweller, and Marie sat in a boarding house with her 2 small children and a bill she could not pay, until he came out again, with a story of a mistaken identity and a smile that no longer quite reached his eyes. Then Cape Town, upon a steamer where he worked their passage as a purser under yet another name. Then Johannesburg in the raw wooden boomtown years, where the 3rd child was born in a tin-roofed room above a hotel bar, a small girl they called Marie after her mother, and where Frederick made and lost a small fortune in a matter of months, speculating upon claims that were not his. Then Klerksdorp, then Kimberley, then back to Cape Town, then home again to England in the steerage of a Union Line steamer, with the 4th child a warm weight in her arms, and the sea grey outside the porthole. The 4th child was a girl too. They named her Liala, though Marie in her heart called her Lily, for the small pale flowers her mother had grown in a tin can on the sill of the cottage in Birkenhead. Liala was born in a lodging-house in Hull upon a raw, wet November morning, with the coal smoke thick in the streets and the horses steaming in the yard. Marie had been very ill before the birth, and very ill after it, and for some weeks she could not rise from the bed. Frederick sat by her a little in the evenings. He brought her a bowl of thin beef tea. He brought her, once, a small bunch of white chrysanthemums from a stall for a penny. He spoke to her softly of the fine house they would soon take, upon a small pension from an uncle in India that was even now upon its way. Marie nodded, and she drank the beef tea, and she stroked the small warm head of the baby at her breast, and she said nothing. She had begun by then to know him. She did not put it into words, even to herself, for she had been raised in a chapel that taught that a wife must not think ill of her husband. But she had counted, over the years, the names upon the letters that came for him, and none of them were quite the same. She had felt him rise in the night and stand by the window for hours in the dark, and she had heard him laugh softly to himself at nothing. She had seen him at the washstand one morning, in the flat glass of the mirror, and there had been a face in there she did not know, cold and flat and empty, before his own face slid back into it like a mask. She had said nothing then either. She had gone about her work. She had washed the small stockings in the tin bowl. She had baked the bread. She had rocked the cradle with her foot while she mended the elbow of Bertha's frock. She was not a stupid woman. She was a patient one, and a proud one, and a woman of her time and her class, who had 4 small children, and no kin, and nowhere upon the wide earth to go. Where was there for a discarded wife to take 4 children in that year? To the workhouse in Hull, where the little ones would be shaved and separated from her and set to pick oakum for their keep. To the streets of a strange town with a beggar's tin. She had seen what became of such women. She had passed them in the doorways of the lodgings-houses of every port. She thought sometimes, in the small hours, of writing to a cousin of her mother's in Birkenhead, who had once been kind to her, and asking for a shelter for the children. But the cousin was old now, and poor herself, and Marie did not know if she still lived, and pride, that gentle, stubborn pride of the working-class wife of that century, would not let her set the pen to the paper. So she stayed. She packed the 2 carpet bags. She followed him, from Hull to Antwerp. From Antwerp back to Liverpool, where he found her lodgings in a mean brick street off Mount Pleasant, and left her there for 3 weeks without a shilling, and she went to a soup kitchen at the chapel, with the 4 children in a line behind her, and the minister's wife gave her a loaf of bread and a jar of dripping, and did not ask her name. From Liverpool to Beverley. From Beverley back to Birkenhead, where at last she stood one grey afternoon in the churchyard of her childhood, and laid a small posy of primroses upon her mother's stone, and Bertha, who was 10 now and grave and quiet, held Liala upon her hip, and did not ask why her mother wept. In the summer of 1891 they were living in a rented house in a small dull street in Rainhill, in the county of Lancashire, some 15 miles from Liverpool. He had told her that he had taken a fine position as a colonial inspector for a company in London, and that he must go up to town for some weeks upon its business. He gave her £3 in silver, and set it upon the mantelpiece, and he kissed the children upon the brow one by one, Bertha, Marie, Sidney, Liala, and he took his hat from the peg by the door, and he said he would send for them when the lodgings in London were ready. Marie stood at the gate in her plain dark dress, and watched him walk to the corner. The sun was low. The starlings were wheeling above the chimneys of the town. He raised his hand to her once, from the corner, and she raised her hand back. Then he turned into the road that led toward the station, and he was gone. She stood a little while longer at the gate. The baby was crying somewhere behind her in the small, warm parlour. Bertha was calling her softly from the door. In her hand, forgotten, she still held a folded scrap of paper he had pressed upon her at the last, upon which he had written, in his neat slanting hand, an address in Rainhill that she had never heard of, and the name of a house, Dinham Villa, where, he had told her, she and the children might come to him very soon. The cottage at Rainhill. The train from Liverpool ran east through the green flat country of South Lancashire. It stopped at every small station along the line, Edge Hill, Wavertree, Broad Green, Roby, Huyton, and at each stop a few farm women got down with their baskets, and a few clerks got up with their newspapers folded under their arms. The carriages smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. The gaslight in the roof hissed softly as the train ran on. In a second-class compartment near the guard's van sat a small pale gentleman in a good dark coat and a stiff round collar, with a leather valise upon the rack above him and a folded copy of the Liverpool Mercury upon his knee. He was perhaps 38 years old. His hair was thinning at the temples. His eyes were of a light, restless blue. When the guard came through for tickets, he raised his hat and gave his name, in his soft, plausible voice, as Mr. Albert Oliver Williams. He was, he said, an inspector of stores for the Australian government, come home to England upon a short leave. The guard punched his ticket and passed on. The village of Rainhill lay some 10 miles east of Liverpool, between the town of Prescott and the small colliery settlement of Sutton. It was a quiet place of stone and brick, gathered about the London and North Western line, where the great through trains for Manchester and the north ran past each hour. The village had grown up around the railway works. Along the high street stood a butcher and a baker and a small draper's shop, where a length of good print cotton could be had for 5p the yard. The commercial hotel faced the station across a strip of pavement. Behind it lay the parish church of St. Bartholomew, of red sandstone and a low square tower, and beyond the church the fields ran away in long, slow slopes toward the smoke of the collieries at St. Helens. There was a rope walk. There was a wheelwright's yard. There was a small chapel of the Wesleyan sort, and a smaller one of the primitive Methodist sort, and a pond where the ducks kept their steady, patient traffic through the summer afternoons. He came off the train upon a warm July evening in the year 1891. He set his valise upon the platform and looked about him with the slow, careful eye of a man taking measure of a new stage. Then he crossed the road to the commercial hotel and took a room for the night at 3 shillings and 6p, and he wrote his name in the register as Albert Oliver Williams of London, upon a short visit to inspect the neighbourhood upon behalf of a colonial company. The landlady poured him a small glass of sherry in the coffee room. He drank it slowly. He asked her, in his soft voice, whether there might be a suitable house to let in the village for a gentleman lately returned from abroad. She thought a moment. She said there was Dinham Villa, at the end of Lawton Road, near the church. It belonged to a Mrs. Mather, whose late husband had been a builder in the town. It stood empty since the spring, and Mrs. Mather was, she thought, glad to let it. He called upon Mrs. Mather the next morning. She was a widow of some 50 years, dressed in the plain black of a Lancashire chapel woman, with a lace collar pinned at her throat, with a small mourning brooch of jet. She kept a neat parlour with a horsehair sofa and a framed print of the Good Shepherd above the mantel. She poured him a cup of tea in a blue china cup. He praised the house. He spoke of the fine position of Rainhill, of the good air and the quiet lanes, and of his own recent return from a long service in the Australian colonies. He paid her a fortnight's rent in advance, upon a lease of 6 months, in silver from a small chamois bag. Mrs. Mather counted the coins into her lap and was well satisfied. She said her daughter would bring him the key that afternoon. The daughter was Emily Lydia Mather. She was 25 years old. She was a tall young woman with dark hair drawn back beneath a straw bonnet, and steady grey eyes, and small quiet hands that had been trained to sew and to bake and to keep a plain house in the plain Lancashire way. She had been engaged once to a young man from Prescott, who had gone out to Canada 3 years before, and who had written her fewer and fewer letters, and who had at last written her none at all. She had put away the ring in a small tin box beneath her bed, and she had spoken of him to no one, and she had gone on with her days at the little draper's shop where she served behind the counter for 11 shillings the week. She came up the path of Dinham Villa that afternoon in a plain grey walking dress, with the key of the front door hanging upon a thin steel ring, and she found Mr. Williams standing at the gate in his good dark coat, smiling. He raised his hat to her. He praised the fineness of the July afternoon. He asked her, as they stood together upon the step, whether she would do him the great kindness of walking through the house with him and pointing out its virtues, for a bachelor's eye, he said, was a poor one for such matters. Emily coloured a little and said that she would. She turned the key in the lock. The door opened upon a narrow hall with a strip of oilcloth upon the boards and a small hat-stand of dark oak. To the right lay the front parlour, papered in a small rose pattern, with a marble mantelpiece and a fireplace fitted with a black iron grate. To the left lay the dining room. Behind them the passage ran back to the kitchen, and behind the kitchen lay a small scullery with a stone sink and a copper for the washing, and a yard beyond with a strip of black soil where a rosebush struggled against the wall. The kitchen was a plain square room, floored with red quarry tiles and with a range of black iron set into the chimney. Before the range lay a broad hearthstone of grey Yorkshire flag, 3 feet square, sunk a little below the level of the tiles around it. Emily pointed out the copper, and the deep pantry, and the good large window that looked upon the yard. Mr. Williams nodded gravely at each. He stood a long moment upon the hearthstone. He tapped it once with the toe of his boot. He remarked, in his soft voice, that the flag was a fine solid piece of work, and that Mrs. Mather's late husband had been, by all accounts, a builder of the first rank. Emily smiled at that, for it pleased her to hear her father praised, and she did not notice the way his blue eyes stayed a moment longer upon the stone than upon anything else in the room. He took possession of Dinham Villa the next day. He had his valise brought from the commercial hotel. He engaged a woman from the village, a Mrs. Anderson, to come in of a morning for 2 shillings the week to sweep and to lay the fires. He walked down to the high street and ordered a small deal table and 2 rush-bottomed chairs from the second-hand shop, and a plain iron bedstead and a horsehair mattress, and a set of cheap china from the draper's, and he had them all delivered on the cart of the wheelwright's man for 1 shilling. He set the table in the front parlour. He set the bed in the room above. He hung his one good coat upon a hook behind the door. In the small back bedroom he placed nothing at all. and he told Mrs. Anderson in his soft voice that she need not trouble to sweep in there, for he meant to use it presently as a workroom and would keep the door locked. He courted Emily Mather from that first week. He came each evening to Mrs. Mather's parlour with a small posy of pinks from the garden of Dinham Villa, or a paper twist of barley sugar for a penny from the shop at the corner, or a book of hymns bound in blue cloth that he had bought at the stall by the station. He sat upon the horsehair sofa with his hat upon his knee. He spoke to Mrs. Mather of the wide green paddocks of Victoria, and of the sheep stations of the Riverina, and of the fine climate of the Australian colonies for a young woman of a delicate constitution. He spoke to Emily, when Mrs. Mather stepped out to the kitchen, of a small white cottage he had seen once at a place called Melbourne, upon a hillside above the bay, and of the roses that grew there 12 months in the year. Emily listened with her hands folded in her lap. She had never been further from Rainhill than a day trip to Southport. She had never crossed a sea. Her steady grey eyes rested upon him in the lamplight, and she did not speak, but a small colour came into her cheeks that had not been there for 3 years. Mrs. Mather approved him. He was a gentleman, plainly, by his coat and his collar and his manner. He paid his rent upon the day. He did not drink at the Commercial. He came to service at St. Bartholomew's on the Sunday morning and set a shilling in the plate. He walked with Emily along the lane to the Sunday afternoon Bible class at the chapel, and he brought her home before dark. In the second week he asked Mrs. Mather, in her front parlour, for her daughter's hand. Mrs. Mather set down her teacup. She looked a long moment at the small pale gentleman before her. Then she said, in her plain Lancashire way, that if Emily was willing, she was willing too, and that the banns might be called at St. Bartholomew's on the following Sunday. Emily was willing. She said so, quietly, in the parlour that evening, with her mother in the kitchen and the lamp turned low upon the table. He kissed her hand. He said he would go up to Liverpool the next day and see about the rings and about the tickets for a wedding journey to the colonies. She smiled and did not answer. She had not spoken to him of the young man from Prescott. She had not put on the ring from the small tin box beneath her bed. She thought she would not need it now. He did go up to Liverpool the next day. He went to a jeweller in Bold Street and bought a plain gold band for 22 shillings, and a smaller one for his own hand, and he had them wrapped in a scrap of white tissue and placed in a small red leather case. He went to the office of the Norddeutscher Lloyd upon the landing stage and inquired the price of 2 second-class berths upon the steamer Kaiser Wilhelm der Zweite, bound for Port Said and Colombo and Melbourne in the middle of November. He paid a small deposit and took away the printed slip. Then he went across the town to an ironmonger's shop in a lane off Byrom Street, where he had never been seen before, and he bought a bricklayer's trowel with a beechwood handle and a small mason's hammer, and 2 large bags of Portland cement, and a sack of clean silver sand, and he arranged for them to be carted out to Rainhill upon the following morning, addressed to Dinham Villa in the name of Albert Williams. The cement and the sand arrived at the back door in the early morning. The carter set them in the scullery for a shilling, and touched his cap and drove away. Mr. Williams thanked him. He shut the back door. He sent Mrs. Anderson home for the day, with a smile and a florin, and he told her that he meant to give the kitchen a small repair, and did not wish to be disturbed. She went, well pleased. He locked the front door. He drew the blinds of the kitchen and the small back bedroom. He set a single tallow candle upon the deal table in the kitchen, and he lit it with a lucifer, and he watched the flames steady in the still summer air. Then he took the trowel and the mason's hammer, and he knelt upon the red quarry tiles before the grey Yorkshire flag, and he began, with slow, careful strokes, to lift the hearthstone. The village of Rainhill was very quiet that morning. The starlings were wheeling above the church tower. The bell rang the hour of 10. A cart went by upon the lane with a load of hay. In the front parlour of Mrs. Mather's house, 2 streets away, Emily was sewing a small white handkerchief with her initials picked out in blue silk in one corner, for her wedding. She hummed softly as she worked. Her mother stood at the kitchen table cutting a lardy cake. The sun came through the muslin curtain and lay in a warm, pale strip across the boards. At Dinham Villa, the blinds stayed drawn. The candle burned low upon the deal table. The scrape of the trowel against the flag went on into the afternoon, and then into the evening, and then into the summer night. Somewhere in a lodging in a mean brick street in Liverpool, in that same hour, a woman named Marie sat by a small window with a folded scrap of paper in her hand, upon which was written, in a neat slanting script, the name of a house in a village she had never heard of, and the promise of a home she and her 4 small children would soon be called to. She did not know yet that the call would come. She did not know yet, as she folded the paper into her Bible for safekeeping, that she and the children were already, in the slow, careful mind of the man behind the drawn blinds at Dinham Villa, no more than a small remaining task, to be finished quickly and sealed neatly beneath the hearthstone of the plain, quiet kitchen where a candle now burned alone. The wedding and the long voyage. The candle upon the deal table burned itself out in the small hours, and the kitchen fell into darkness. Mr. Williams, for he was Mr. Williams here now, in this quiet Lancashire village, laid down the trowel and wiped his hands upon a rag. He climbed the narrow stairs to the front bedroom, and slept until the starlings woke him at dawn. 2 days later, a telegram was sent from the post office at Rainhill to a lodging in a mean brick street off Mount Pleasant in Liverpool. It was addressed to Mrs. Marie Williams. It bore the neat slanting hand of her husband, and it said only that the lodgings were now ready, and that she and the children were to come by the afternoon train upon the following Thursday, and that he would meet them at the station. Marie folded the telegram into her Bible. She had been 10 days in Liverpool with the 4 children, and only the last of the £3 in silver. The rent was owed. She packed the 2 carpet bags with the quiet, efficient hands that had packed them so many times before. The children's clothes, her own 2 dresses, the Bible, the lock of her mother's hair in the scrap of black silk. Bertha, who was 10, folded the little stockings of her sisters. Sidney, who was 7, sat upon the trunk with Liala upon his knee and sang her a small song he had learned in a schoolroom in Cape Town. Marie looked at them from the doorway and thought that they were good children and clean children and quiet children, and that their father would surely be pleased. The Thursday train pulled in at Rainhill station in the late afternoon. The light was pale and slanting. The starlings were wheeling above the church tower. Marie stepped down onto the platform with Liala in her arms, and Bertha's small gloved hand tucked into her own. Sidney and small Marie came after, holding hands in the way she had taught them. And there upon the platform, in his good dark coat and his stiff round collar, waited a small pale gentleman with a smile that did not quite reach his blue eyes. He kissed her upon the cheek and kissed each of the children upon the brow. He took the 2 carpet bags in one hand and set his other hand beneath her elbow. He said in his soft voice that the house was but a short walk down the lane, and that a good tea was laid ready upon the deal table, a fresh loaf, a pat of butter, a pot of raspberry jam bought that morning for 4p. He led them along the quiet road that ran toward Lawton Road and the church of St. Bartholomew and the small brick villa at the end of the lane. No one in Rainhill saw them arrive. Mrs. Anderson had been sent home for the week with 3 shillings and a smile. The blinds of Dinham Villa had been drawn since the morning. He opened the front door with his key and stood aside to let them pass in, first Marie, then Bertha with small Marie, then Sidney holding Liala's small hand, and he closed the door behind them, and he turned the key in the lock. What passed within those walls that summer evening is not written down. Only the plain facts remain in the parish record and the coroner's book. 5 bodies laid in a shallow pit beneath the grey Yorkshire flag of the kitchen hearth. The children set neatly in a row, wrapped each in a scrap of grey blanket. Marie laid a little apart, her wedding ring still upon her finger, a shawl of dark wool drawn across her face. Fresh Portland cement poured smoothly over all, and smoothed with the trowel, and set to dry through the warm, still night. By the morning, the hearthstone had been lowered again into its place. A thin band of new mortar ran around the edge, pale against the older grout. The kitchen was swept. The candle was replaced. The blinds were drawn open upon the small green yard. Mrs. Anderson came back upon the Monday. She noticed the mortar and asked, in her plain Lancashire way, whether the gentleman had been mending the hearth. He said that he had. He said that the flag had shifted a little in the summer heat, and that he had lifted it and set it right, and that the mortar would harden in a few days more. Mrs. Anderson nodded. She swept the kitchen. She did not go into the small back bedroom, for he had told her, in his soft voice, not to trouble. The banns had been called at St. Bartholomew's upon 3 Sundays. Emily had sat in her plain grey dress in the pew beside her mother, and had heard her name spoken in the still air of the church, and had felt the eyes of the village turn kindly upon her. The rector was a Mr. Robinson, a stout grey man of 50 years who had baptised her as an infant. He came to Mrs. Mather's parlour on a Wednesday evening, and drank a cup of tea, and spoke gently of the duties of a wife. Emily bought her wedding dress at the draper's shop for 32 shillings, a plain cream silk with a small lace collar and a row of pearl buttons down the bodice. Mrs. Mather had let down the hem herself upon the kitchen table by the lamp. They were married upon the 22nd of September, in the year 1891, upon a soft grey morning with a fine mist upon the fields. Emily walked to the church on the arm of her uncle, a small farmer from over toward Prescott. She wore the cream silk dress and a small posy of white asters from her mother's garden. He stood at the altar in his good dark coat and his stiff round collar, with his hair combed smooth and his hands folded before him. He gave his name to the rector as Albert Oliver Williams, ship's inspector, of Dinham Villa in the parish. He set his neat slanting signature in the register. Emily wrote her own name beside his in a small careful hand. The witnesses were her uncle and a churchwarden named Mr. Alcock. The bells rang softly as they came out into the churchyard. They kept the wedding breakfast at Mrs. Mather's house. A cold ham, a dish of buttered peas, a lardy cake baked that morning by Mrs. Mather's own hand, and a single bottle of sweet sherry poured into small glasses. The rector spoke a few kind words. The uncle from Prescott lifted his glass and wished the couple long life and many children. Emily coloured and looked at her plate. Mr. Williams rose and thanked the company, in his soft, plausible voice, and he said that they must leave Rainhill within the fortnight, for the steamer sailed for the colonies in early November, and there was much to be seen to before they went aboard. Emily did not see Dinham Villa again as her home. The key had been left with Mrs. Mather, to be handed to the next tenant. The blinds of the kitchen were drawn open now, and the pale September light lay warm upon the swept red tiles, and the mortar around the hearthstone was set hard and dry, the same colour almost as the older grout. Rainhill went about its business. The starlings wheeled above the church tower. The bells of St. Bartholomew's rang the hours through the mild autumn afternoons. The Kaiser Wilhelm II lay at her berth in the harbour at Southampton, a great black-hulled steamer of the Norddeutscher Lloyd, with tall funnels striped in red and white and raked masts of pine. Her second-class cabins lay amidships, with small round scuttles that looked upon the sea, and neat pine bunks with clean linen and a shared washroom at the end of the passage. Mr. and Mrs. Williams came aboard upon a raw November morning, with 2 leather trunks and a carpet bag and a hat box. He was in his good dark coat. She was in a new travelling dress of dark blue serge that he had bought her the day before in a shop in Ludgate Hill for £2.10. She held his arm as they crossed the gangway. The wind came off the water cold and salt. The gulls cried above the funnels. She looked back once at the smoky sprawl of the docks, and then she turned her face toward the ship, and she did not look back again. The voyage was to be nearly 6 weeks. The steamer would call at Gibraltar, at Naples, at Port Said, at Suez, at Aden, at Colombo, and at last at Melbourne, where she was due in the middle of December. Second-class fare was some 28 guineas a head. He had paid it in gold from a small chamois bag at the office of the line. He had signed the passenger book in his neat, slanting hand as Mr. and Mrs. Albert Williams of London, bound for Melbourne to take up a colonial appointment. The purser had smiled and stamped their tickets. They dined in the second-class saloon upon the first evening at a long table of polished oak. There were a Presbyterian minister and his wife bound for Adelaide, a wool broker returning to his station in the Riverina, a young medical man going out to a post in Ballarat, a widowed schoolmistress with 2 half-grown daughters going to keep house for her brother in Melbourne, and a scattering of clerks and small merchants and farmers' sons. Mr. Williams sat at the head of his section of the table with Emily upon his right hand. He praised the soup. He praised the mutton. He asked after each person by name and remembered the names when they came round again. He spoke of Melbourne as a man who knew it well. He spoke of the sheep stations beyond the Murray and the gold country round Ballarat, and the fine climate of the colony for a young woman of a delicate constitution. Emily listened with her hands folded in her lap. She thought her husband a very fine speaker. After dinner, the passengers gathered in the second-class music room, a small pine-panelled chamber with a cottage piano at one end. The widowed schoolmistress played "The Last Rose of Summer" with a slow, steady hand. The minister's wife sang a verse in a thin, true soprano. Then Mr. Williams rose and asked whether the company would care to see a little trick. He took a pack of cards from his pocket. He fanned them out upon the small round table by the piano. He asked the young medical man to draw one, and to hold it against his breast, and to think upon it very hard. He shuffled the deck with a neat, quick motion. He set it down. He tapped it once with his finger. He turned up the top card, and there, plain as day, in the yellow gaslight, was the Queen of Hearts. The company laughed and clapped. He bowed a little, with a soft smile, and gathered the cards. He sang a comic song he had learned in a music hall in Sydney some 10 years before, a song about a sailor and a lady in a straw hat, in a light, pleasant tenor that carried well in the small pine-panelled room. When he was done, the wool broker slapped him upon the back and called him a fine fellow, and Emily blushed with a quiet pride at her chair by the wall. So the voyage went on. The days ran long and blue upon the water. The great steamer drove south past the coast of Portugal, and through the Straits of Gibraltar with the Rock, a great grey shoulder upon the port beam. They dined each evening at the long oak table. They gathered each evening in the music room. Mr. Williams did his card tricks, and sang his songs, and told his stories of the sheep stations and the gold fields, and the fortune that awaited a clever man in the Australian colonies. He was, all the passengers agreed, the best company on board. He was courteous to the ladies. He was jovial with the men. He gave a shilling to the deck steward each Sunday morning without fail. He knelt beside Emily in the small hymn service in the saloon, and sang the Te Deum in his light, pleasant tenor. At Port Said he took Emily ashore in a bumboat for the day. The heat was thick and yellow. The muezzin was calling from a minaret above the mud-coloured roofs. He bought her a small pair of Turkish slippers of red leather worked with silver thread for 2 shillings. He bought her a paper twist of sugared dates. He led her through the bazaar and pointed out the strange bright silks and the great copper trays. She held his arm very tight. In the evening they came back aboard, and she stood at the rail as the great steamer moved on into the canal, and the pale desert ran away on either side, and the first stars came out above the low sand hills, and she thought that she was the happiest woman upon the sea. She wrote to her mother from Colombo. She said the voyage was fine and the company kind. She said her husband was the most attentive gentleman upon the ship. She said Melbourne was but a fortnight away now, and that she would write again from that fine, bright city. She signed the letter, in her small, careful schoolgirl hand, "Your loving daughter, Emily Williams." She sealed it with a wafer of red wax. She gave it to the ship's mail with a smile and a sixpence. Her husband stood beside her at the rail as the steamer pulled out of Colombo harbour that evening. The palms upon the shore turned black against the last red of the sky. The lamps of the town came on one by one along the waterfront. He put his arm about her shoulders, softly, as a gentleman might. He looked out across the darkening sea toward the south, toward the wide grey ocean that lay between them and the port of Melbourne, and he did not speak. His blue eyes rested a long moment upon the horizon. In the neat slanting mind behind them, he was already at work upon the small brick cottage he would take in a quiet lane somewhere south of the river, and upon the trowel and the cement that he would buy in a shop in Chapel Street, and upon the shallow pit that he would dig, with slow, careful strokes, beneath a certain hearthstone in a room whose blinds he had not yet drawn. The cottage in Windsor. The steamer came into Port Phillip Bay upon a soft grey morning in the middle of December. The heads stood pale in the mist. The pilot came out in a small cutter and clambered up the swinging ladder in his blue coat. Emily stood at the rail in her dark blue serge and watched the low green shore slide by. The gulls turned above the mast. She could smell the eucalyptus already, sharp and strange, drifting out across the water. Her husband stood beside her with his hand upon the rail. He pointed out the small red roofs of Queenscliff and the pale line of a lighthouse, and the fishing boats at anchor in the shallow bay. He named each thing in his soft, plausible voice, as a man named the streets of his own town. They came alongside the pier at Port Melbourne in the middle of the afternoon. The great steamer warped in slowly beneath a hot yellow sun. The dockers stood along the timber wharf in their canvas trousers, singing out to the men on deck. The gangway went down with a heavy bang. Emily walked ashore upon her husband's arm, and the earth of the colony felt strange and steady beneath her small booted feet after so many weeks at sea. He led her to a cab upon the pier. He gave the driver an address in a lodging house in Little Collins Street. He set the 2 leather trunks upon the box and lifted her into the seat beside him. The horse trotted up through the flat streets of Port Melbourne, past the small wooden shop fronts and the timber yards, and away toward the tall buildings of the town. Emily sat with her gloved hands folded upon her lap. She watched the strange bright light upon the roofs. She watched a woman in a straw hat sweeping the pavement before a public house. She thought that the colony was very fine. They took 2 rooms at the lodging house for a week, at 15 shillings the week, full board. The landlady was a stout Scotswoman called Mrs. Rouncefell. She served a good mutton and a plain rice pudding. She admired the fair young English bride, and pressed a second helping upon her plate. In the evenings, Mr. Williams sat in the parlour with the other lodgers, and told his stories of the Australian colonies, and did his card trick with the Queen of Hearts, and the company laughed and clapped, and thought him the finest gentleman upon the street. But he did not stay long in Little Collins Street. Upon the second morning he went out early, and did not come back until dusk. He said he had been about the town looking at small houses to let. He said the lodging was dear, and that a quiet cottage south of the river would suit a bride better than a public parlour. Emily said whatever he wished would suit her. He kissed her upon the brow and set a paper twist of boiled sweets upon the washstand for a penny. Then he went out again in the morning, and again upon the 3rd day, and upon the 4th. He had found the cottage upon the 3rd afternoon. It stood in a quiet lane in Windsor, called Andrew Street, some 2 miles south of the river, in a row of small brick houses with slate roofs and low iron gates. The rent was 11 shillings the week, unfurnished. The agent was a Mr. Connop in Chapel Street. Mr. Williams sat in the small dusty office and gave his name, in his soft voice, as Mr. Druin, lately arrived from England upon a private business, and he paid a month's rent in advance in silver from a chamois bag. Mr. Connop counted the coins and wrote the receipt in his careful hand. He did not ask for a reference. In the colony of Victoria, in that year, a month's rent in silver was reference enough. The cottage had 2 rooms in the front and a kitchen at the back, with a small scullery and a strip of yard beyond. The floors were of pine boards in the parlour and red quarry tiles in the kitchen. A cast-iron range stood against the kitchen wall. In the small back bedroom, off the passage, stood a simple bricked fireplace, with a hearthstone of grey bluestone set flush into the tiles. He walked through the empty rooms upon the afternoon of the 3rd day, and stood a long moment upon that hearthstone. He tapped it once with the toe of his boot. He nodded slowly. Then he locked the front door behind him and walked back to the tram in Chapel Street. He brought Emily to the cottage upon the 5th day. He had bought a plain deal table and 4 rush-bottomed chairs from a broker in Paran for £1.6. He had bought an iron bedstead and a horsehair mattress, and a small chest of drawers with a spotted glass, and a china jug and basin, and a set of cheap plates from a shop in Chapel Street for 11 shillings the lot. He had hung a coloured print of Her Majesty above the parlour mantel, and set a rag rug upon the boards, and lit a small fire in the range. When Emily came in at the door with her carpet bag, she stood a long moment in the little parlour and looked about her. She saw the print of the Queen. She saw the small posy of jasmine in a jam jar upon the deal table. She turned to her husband with a shy, soft smile and thanked him. She met the neighbour that first afternoon, over the low iron gate. The neighbour was a stout, kindly woman called Mrs. Wilkinson, who kept a small green parrot in a wicker cage upon her veranda. She admired Emily's fair hair and her gentle Lancashire voice. She asked where the nearest baker might be found. Mrs. Wilkinson pointed her down to a shop upon the corner where a fresh loaf could be had for 3d. Emily walked down the lane in her plain dark travelling dress with a small basket upon her arm, and she bought the loaf and a 1/4 pound of butter and a screw of tea, and she came home again along the sandy pavement in the hot afternoon sun, and thought that the colony was very kind. He was gone the next morning. He left before she was awake. He came home at noon with a small brown parcel under his arm. He set it upon the deal table without a word. Emily asked in her quiet way what he had brought. He smiled at her. He said it was only a small tool for a repair he meant to make upon the hearthstone in the back room, for the flag had shifted a little and would rattle in the night. He unwrapped the parcel. Inside lay a bricklayer's trowel with a beechwood handle, plain and new, from an ironmonger in Chapel Street. He turned it once in his hand in the yellow light of the kitchen. Then he set it upon the shelf above the range. Upon the following afternoon he came home again with a canvas sack over his shoulder. It was a bag of Portland cement, bought from the same ironmonger for 4 shillings. He set it in the scullery. He told Emily that a good handful of cement would set the flag right, and that he would attend to it in the evening while she slept, so as not to trouble her with the dust. Emily nodded. She served him a plate of cold mutton and a slice of bread and butter. She poured him a cup of tea from the brown china pot. She watched him eat with the quiet, steady pride of a new wife. That evening he sat with her in the small parlour by the light of a single kerosene lantern upon the deal table. He read aloud to her from a book of poems he had bought at a stall in Burke Street for 6d. She sewed the hem of a small linen handkerchief with her initials picked out in blue silk in one corner. Outside, the cicadas sang in the tall pepper trees along the lane. A horse cab went by, the wheels crunching upon the gravel. At 10 o'clock she rose and kissed him upon the brow and went up to the small bedroom above and lay down upon the iron bedstead with her hair loose upon the pillow. She fell asleep almost at once. She was very tired. The voyage had been long, and the strange bright light of the colony had wearied her more than she knew. He waited an hour in the parlour by the low lantern. Then he rose. He took the trowel from the shelf above the range. He took the bag of cement from the scullery. He fetched a pail of clean water from the tap in the yard. He set them all upon the red quarry tiles of the kitchen floor. He lit a second candle upon the small deal table and set it in a saucer. Then he walked softly along the passage to the small back bedroom and stood a long moment in the doorway in the flickering light. What passed within those walls that summer night is not written down in any hand but one, and that hand has never been trusted. Only the plain facts remain in the coroner's book, some weeks later, when the constable's lantern went down through the cracked mortar. A young woman lay in a shallow pit beneath the hearthstone of the small back room, wrapped in a scrap of her own patterned shawl. Her nightdress was of white cambric edged with a thin lace. Her small brown boots had been placed beside her, laces tied together in a neat bow. Her wedding ring was still upon her finger. A folded shawl of grey and rose wool had been drawn across her face, as by someone who did not wish to look upon it again. The mortar around the flag was of Portland cement, mixed with clean silver sand, laid smoothly with a trowel by a careful, patient hand. It was still faintly damp when the flies first found it. By the morning the hearthstone was set. He swept the floor with a broom of tied twigs. He carried the pail and the empty sack out into the yard and burned the sack in the rusted brazier by the fence. He washed the trowel at the tap. He set it back upon the shelf above the range. Then he went into the parlour and lay down upon the horsehair sofa in his shirt-sleeves and slept a full and quiet sleep until the pale light of the summer dawn came through the drawn curtain and touched the print of Her Majesty above the mantel. Mrs. Wilkinson came to the low iron gate that afternoon with a jar of quince jam. She had not seen Emily upon the pavement all the day. She asked, in her plain, kindly way, whether the young Mrs. Drewin was quite well. Mr. Drewin met her at the gate in his good dark coat. He raised his hat. He said, in his soft, plausible voice, that his wife had been taken with a small feverish turn upon the previous evening, and that a cousin of his, in Bacchus Marsh, had sent word by telegram that morning, inviting her out to the country for a week of quiet air. He said that she had gone up upon the noon train. He thanked Mrs. Wilkinson very kindly for the jam. He said he would tell his wife of her kindness when she wrote. Mrs. Wilkinson smiled and went back along the lane with an empty basket, and she was well satisfied. The grocer's boy called upon the 15th of the month with a pound of tea and a tin of golden syrup that Mr. Drewin had ordered by note. He answered the door only a crack. He took the parcel through the gap. He dropped a shilling into the boy's small brown hand without a word. The boy remembered afterward the smell of fresh mortar drifting out from the dim passage, sweet and thick beneath the summer heat. He thought nothing of it at the time. He touched his cap and went back to the cart. Within the fortnight, Mr. Drewin was ready to go. He had written to Mr. Connop of the agent's office in Chapel Street to settle his rent to the end of the month and to give up the lease. He had packed a single leather trunk with his good dark coat and his stiff round collar and his shaving things and a small red leather case containing a plain gold band that had been Emily's, upon which he had polished the inside with a scrap of chamois. He had walked down to the office of the coastal steamers upon the wharves at Port Melbourne and bought a second-class ticket upon the steamer bound north for Sydney at the end of the week. He had signed the passenger book in his neat slanting hand as Mr. Baron Swanston of Melbourne upon a small business north. Upon his last evening at the cottage he sat a long while upon the deal table in the kitchen with a single tallow candle burning before him. He drank a cup of tea from the brown china pot. He looked slowly about the little room. He looked at the red quarry tiles. He looked at the black iron range where a small kettle still sat upon the hob. He looked at the trowel upon the shelf above, its beechwood handle smooth and pale in the yellow light. He rose at last and set the trowel into a scrap of sacking and tied it with a length of twine and laid it in the top of his leather trunk. Then he blew out the candle. He left Andrew Street upon the morning train from Windsor station. He carried the leather trunk upon his shoulder to the corner of Chapel Street and hailed a spring cart for sixpence. The driver set the trunk beside him upon the box. Mr. Drewin took his seat upon the wooden bench with his hat pulled low against the summer sun. The horse trotted up through the quiet lanes toward the station. In the low iron gate of number 57, Mrs. Wilkinson stood a moment with her hand upon the latch and watched the cart go by. She raised a hand to him. He raised his hat gravely in return and did not smile. The train ran north through the flat brown country of the colony, past the small pale wooden stations and the paddocks of pale grass, and away toward the border and the great river beyond. He sat in the second-class carriage with the leather trunk upon the rack above him. He read the folded copy of the Argus he had bought at the platform for a penny. He watched the country slide past the window. He thought upon the shape of his next stage. A steamer for Sydney. Perhaps a passage on to New Zealand, or a train up the coast to Brisbane, or a berth on a ship for the Cape. He had a little money still in the chamois bag. He had a new name ready upon the tip of his tongue. He had, in the neat, slanting mind behind his light, restless blue eyes, the plain, quiet satisfaction of a task carried through to its close. He did not know, as the train ran on into the hot northern afternoon, that the summer heat in the small back bedroom in Andrew Street was already at its slow, patient work. He did not know that a new tenant would take the cottage within the fortnight, or that a young wife would set a rag rug upon the boards and hang a print of Her Majesty above the mantel, or that on the third evening she would kneel by a small wicker cradle and sniff softly at the air and turn to her husband with a puzzled frown. He did not know that a plumber's knees were already, in the quiet, slow future, moving toward a certain hearthstone in a certain small back room, or that a sergeant's cap was already being lifted from a black-moustached head in a lantern's yellow light. He knew only that the country slid by, and that the wheels sang upon the rails, and that the small leather trunk upon the rack above him held all the world he needed. The train ran on toward Sydney. The summer settled deeper upon the colony behind him, and somewhere far across the sea, in a stone cottage in a quiet Lancashire village, an autumn wind was beginning to rise around the walls of Dinham Villa, where a certain grey Yorkshire flag lay still and quiet in the swept red kitchen, and waited. The trowel and the telegram. The lantern still burned upon the mantel of the small back bedroom in Andrew Street, when the coroner came at last, a little before midnight, in a cab from South Yarra. His name was Dr. Yule. He was a slight grey-bearded man of 50 years, in a black frock coat, with a small leather bag in his hand. Sergeant Considine met him at the low iron gate and touched his cap. The two men walked down the sandy pavement in silence and passed into the dim hall, and the coroner set his bag upon the deal table in the parlour and drew out his notebook and his steel-nibbed pen. He did not speak. He went softly along the passage to the small back room and stood a long moment in the doorway with the yellow lantern light upon his grey beard, and then he knelt at the edge of the shallow pit and set his fingers gently against the cold curve of a pale wrist. He wrote in his book by the lantern. He wrote the sex, the age, the height, the colour of the hair. He wrote of the plain gold wedding band upon the finger, and of the nightdress of white cambric edged with a thin lace, and of the small brown boots placed beside the body, with their laces tied together in a neat bow. He wrote of the folded shawl of grey and rose wool that had been drawn across the face, as by someone who did not wish to look upon it after the work was done. He wrote of the marks upon the throat. Then he closed the book and rose slowly from his knees and stood beside the sergeant in the flickering light, and said only that the young woman had died by another's hand, and that a coroner's court must sit upon her within the week. They carried her out in the small hours in a plain pine shell, brought upon a mortuary cart from the city. Two constables lifted her softly by the shoulders and the ankles. The shawl was drawn once more across her face. The cart went slowly up the sandy lane in the warm dark, its lamp swinging upon the shaft, and Mrs. Wilkinson at the next door stood in her nightdress behind her drawn curtain and watched it pass, and pressed her hand against her mouth, and did not sleep again until the dawn. The morning papers carried the first small notice. The Age set it upon the 5th page, in 6 lines of small type. The Argus set it upon the 3rd. A young woman, so far unidentified, had been found beneath a hearthstone in a cottage in Andrew Street, Windsor, in circumstances suggesting foul play. The police were making inquiry. Within a day the notice had grown. By the 3rd day it was upon the front page, beneath a heavy black rule, and the wharves and the tea shops and the tramcars of Melbourne spoke of little else. Sergeant Considine received in one morning 9 callers at the Prayford station, each certain that they had known the gentleman in the black felt hat. He had drunk at a bar in Burke Street. He had bought a hat at a shop in Collins Street. He had sat in a pew at St. Paul's upon a Sunday morning and sung the Te Deum in a light, pleasant tenor. The sergeant wrote each account carefully in his book. Mr. Connop, the agent from Chapel Street, came to the station upon the 4th morning in a great agitation. He carried in his hand the small green ledger from his office. He turned the pages with his thumb. He set his finger upon a line and read out, in his careful clerk's voice, that the cottage at number 57 had been let upon the 12th of December to a Mr. Druin, gentleman, lately arrived from England. He said the rent had been paid in silver. He said the gentleman had given up the lease upon the middle of January and departed, as he had understood it, for Sydney upon the morning train. The sergeant sent a telegram that afternoon to the police at Sydney, at the cost of 1 shilling and 3pence for the 12 words. He gave a description of the small, pale gentleman in the black felt hat. He gave the name Druin. He asked for inquiry at the lodging houses about Circular Quay and the Rocks, and at the offices of the coastal and colonial steamers. He sent a second telegram to Adelaide. He sent a third to Brisbane. Then he walked back to Andrew Street in the hot afternoon with his black moustached face very still, and he stood a long while in the swept-back room and looked at the empty shallow pit and the pale broken mortar upon the boards, and he thought. The young woman was identified upon the 5th day. A carter from Port Melbourne, who had unloaded her trunks from the Kaiser Wilhelm der Zweite in the middle of December, came forward at the notice in the Argus. He remembered the young English bride in the dark blue serge, and the small pale gentleman upon her arm, and the 2 leather trunks upon which the shipping labels had still been fresh. He remembered, in particular, that one of the trunks had been marked in white paint with the letters E.M. The sergeant went that evening to the office of the Norddeutscher Lloyd upon the wharves. The purser produced his book. He turned to the sailing of the 15th of November from Southampton. There, in a clerk's copperplate hand, stood the entry, Mr. and Mrs. Albert Williams of London, 2nd class, bound for Melbourne. And beside it, in the passenger's own neat slanting hand, the initials of the bride upon the fly-leaf of the printed receipt, Emily Lydia Williams, formerly Mather, of Rainhill in the county of Lancashire, England. The telegram left the office of the Victoria Police upon the 8th day. It was addressed to the Chief Constable of Lancashire at Preston. It carried, in the short economical language of the wire, the name Emily Lydia Mather, the village of Rainhill, and a brief account of the manner in which she had been found. It cost the colony some £3 7 and 6pence to send. It ran along the wires from Melbourne to Adelaide, from Adelaide across the desert to Port Darwin, and from Port Darwin beneath the sea by the great cable to Java, and from Java to Singapore, and from Singapore to Madras, and from Madras to Aden, and from Aden to Malta, and from Malta at last to London, and up the northern wires to Preston. It arrived within some 3 days, in a soft grey Lancashire afternoon, upon the desk of a chief constable who read it once, and then a second time, and then folded it slowly in half and sent a sergeant upon the next train to Rainhill. The sergeant came into the village upon the 10 o'clock train. His name was Kinsman. He was a broad man with a red face and a plain, steady manner. He walked from the station past the commercial hotel and along the high street toward the parish church, and at the corner he asked a small boy where the house of Mrs. Mather might be found. The boy pointed the way. The sergeant walked up the path in his black overcoat and lifted the brass knocker and rapped twice. Mrs. Mather herself came to the door. She wore her plain black dress and the lace collar pinned with the small mourning brooch of jet. She had had no letter from Emily since the letter from Colombo. She had told herself, through the long Lancashire winter, that the colonial post was slow, and that a new bride upon a new shore had much to see to before she took up her pen. She looked now at the sergeant upon her step, and she saw his face, and she knew before he had spoken a word. She stood aside and let him into the parlour. She sat down upon the horsehair sofa beneath the framed print of the Good Shepherd. She listened to what he told her in his plain, steady voice. She did not weep. She only said, once, very quietly, that she had thought there was something wrong about the gentleman from the first, and that she had been afraid to speak of it. The sergeant asked whether he might see the house that Emily and her husband had taken in the village. Mrs. Mather rose and fetched a small tin from the kitchen dresser. Within it lay a single steel key upon a thin ring, wrapped in a scrap of tissue. Dinham Villa had stood empty since the wedding. She had put a card in the window of the draper's shop, and one in the porch of the chapel, but no tenant had yet come. She gave the sergeant the key. She said she would send her uncle from Prescott to walk with him along the lane. She could not, she said, go herself. The uncle came within the hour. He was a small farmer in a brown corduroy coat, and he had wept in the kitchen with his sister for some minutes before he had put on his hat. He walked with the sergeant along Lawton Road in a soft grey drizzle. The starlings were wheeling above the church tower, The bells of St. Bartholomew's rang the quarter as they passed the porch. At the end of the lane stood the small brick villa with the low iron gate and the strip of black soil where the rosebush had grown wild through the winter. The sergeant turned the key in the lock and opened the door. The hall was cold. The oilcloth was streaked with damp. The sergeant walked slowly through the front parlour and the dining room and the passage to the back. In the small kitchen he stood a long moment upon the red quarry tiles and looked at the grey Yorkshire flag before the black iron range. He saw the thin band of pale mortar around the edge, hardened now to almost the colour of the older grout, but still, to a careful eye, a shade lighter. He tapped the flag once with the toe of his boot. He heard the small hollow note beneath. He straightened slowly. He asked the uncle, in his plain voice, whether the parish sexton might be sent for, with a pick and a lantern. The sexton came in the falling light of the afternoon. He was a stout old man with a white moustache and a shovel over his shoulder. 2 constables came with him, and the vicar, Mr. Robinson, in his black cassock, and a small crowd of village men who had followed at a distance from the high street. The blinds of Dinham Villa were drawn close. A lantern was set upon the mantel. The sexton knelt upon the red tiles and struck the pale mortar with the point of his pick, once and then again, and the dry Lancashire winter had hardened it, but it broke at last with a small dry crack. The smell that came out of the opening in the still cold air of the kitchen was faint but unmistakable, sweet and thick and old, the same smell that had risen from a certain small back bedroom on the far side of the world some 4 weeks before. They lifted the flag together in silence. Beneath it lay a shallow pit, no more than 2 feet deep, dug into the black Lancashire earth and lined roughly upon the sides with cement. Within the pit lay 4 small figures, laid in a neat row, each wrapped in a scrap of grey blanket. Bertha at one end, with her small gloved hand still folded across her breast. Then Marie the child, then Sydney, then Liala at the other end, no larger than a folded doll. Their heads had been turned each toward the small wall of the pit. Their small booted feet lay together in the middle. And a little apart from them, laid alone against the wall of the pit, was the body of a slight fair woman in a plain dark dress, with a wedding ring upon her finger and a shawl of dark wool drawn across her face. The sergeant took off his cap. The vicar knelt in his black cassock upon the red tiles and set his hand against the cold, pale brow of the smallest child. He spoke a few soft words in the Latin that his church had taught him. The sexton stood with his shovel across his shoulders and did not move. Outside, in the falling Lancashire dusk, a starling cried above the church tower, and the bell of St. Bartholomew's began to ring the hour. The news went out that night upon the wire. From Preston to London. From London to the great papers of Fleet Street. By the morning it was in every newsroom in the kingdom. By the afternoon it had crossed the Channel to Paris, and by the second evening it was upon the wires again to New York and to Berlin, and back down to Melbourne, where the papers set it upon the front page beneath a heavy black rule. 5 bodies at Rainhill, 1 at Windsor. A gentleman in a black felt hat, a trowel and a bag of Portland cement. A neat slanting hand that had signed itself Druin and Williams and Swanston and Lawson, and God alone knew what beside. It was in a small tavern in Fleet Street, upon the second night, that the first of the whispers was written down. A reporter for a penny paper sat at a marble table with a glass of hot brandy and turned the notice over in his mind. He thought of the small brick cottages of Whitechapel some 3 years before, and of the still autumn mornings when the constables had knelt in the fog beside a certain sort of quiet body. He thought of the plain economy of the work, and of the neat patient hand that had folded the shawls, and of the fact that no man had ever been taken for those Whitechapel nights. He drew his notebook toward him. He wrote, in a small, quick hand, that a gentleman in a black felt hat had been seen upon the wharves of Melbourne, and that the same gentleman had lately kept a house in a Lancashire village where a mother and 4 small children had been sealed beneath a kitchen floor, and that some in the trade were beginning, in the small hours, to wonder whether the fog of Whitechapel and the summer heat of Windsor might yet be joined by the same steady, patient hand. The paper set the paragraph upon the 3rd page. Within a day, it had been copied in a dozen others. Within a week, the name of Jack the Ripper had been printed beside the name of Frederick Deeming in every capital of Europe and in every colonial paper from Cape Town to Sydney. In a small cell in the police lock-up at Perth in the colony of Western Australia, a small pale gentleman with light, restless blue eyes stood at the barred window and looked out at the hot red dust of the wharf where he had been taken from the deck of a coastal steamer some 3 days before. He had been arrested under the name of Baron Swanston. He had been identified from the description upon the wire. He had, for the first time in the long, slanting years since a boy had walked south from Ashby-de-la-Zouch, no new name ready upon the tip of his tongue. The wires sang above the roofs of Perth. The constable turned the key in the lock. And upon a fast steamer of the coastal service, a warrant of extradition was already being carried east across the great southern ocean toward a certain dock at Melbourne and a courthouse at Russell Street, and a young barrister in a plain black gown who did not yet know that his brief was upon its way. The dock at Melbourne. The steamer that brought him east from the colony of Western Australia was the coastal boat Ballarat, of some 1,400 tons, with a red funnel and a black hull streaked with rust from the long run across the bight. She came into the port of Melbourne upon a raw grey morning in the middle of March, in the year 1892, with a low sky above the heads and a fine cold rain drifting upon the water. Along the wharf at Port Melbourne, a crowd had gathered since the first light. There were women with shawls drawn tight against the wet, and clerks in dark overcoats, and small boys who had come down upon the early tram from South Melbourne to see the man in the black felt hat brought ashore in irons. The constables had put up a plain wooden barrier across the head of the gangway, and 2 mounted troopers sat upon their horses at either side, in their blue serge and their pale straw helmets, with the rain running from the brims. He came down the gangway between 2 officers of the Victoria Police. He was in a plain grey suit that had been given him at the lock-up in Fremantle. His wrists were cuffed before him in a set of iron bracelets joined by a short chain. He was smaller than the crowd had expected. He was thin in the shoulder. His hair was combed back neatly from his brow. He wore no hat. He looked once, quickly, at the crowd along the wharf, and his light, restless blue eyes moved across the faces without pausing, as a man might read a printed page too fast to take in the words. Then he lowered his gaze to the wet timber of the wharf, and he walked steadily between his guards to the closed cab that stood waiting beyond the barrier. A woman in a shawl called out something as he passed. A boy threw a small clod of wet earth that struck the shoulder of the constable at his side. The constable did not turn his head. The cab door was opened. He stepped up into the dim interior with a small, careful movement, and the door was shut behind him, and the cab moved off along the wharf toward the road that led into the town. They took him to the Gale at Melbourne, in Russell Street, in the heart of the city. It was a great grey building of dressed bluestone, 4 stories high, with narrow arched windows set deep into the wall and a heavy iron gate below. The gate was opened. The cab passed within. The gate was closed again with a slow, heavy sound behind him. He was taken to a cell upon the second gallery, some 8 feet by 6, with a single small window high in the outer wall and a plain iron cot with a straw palliasse and a grey blanket folded upon the foot. The door was of iron, with a small square grille at the eye. It was closed and locked. He sat down upon the edge of the cot in his plain grey suit, and he looked about the small cold cell in the pale morning light, and he did not speak. The trial was set for the last week of April, before the Supreme Court of the colony of Victoria, in the old bluestone courthouse in Russell Street, a little way along from the jail. The judge was to be Mr. Justice Hodges, a tall, grave man of some 50 years, with a lean, grey face and a plain, steady voice, who had sat upon the bench for 4 years and was known through the colony as a fair man and a careful one. The prosecution was in the hands of the Crown Solicitor's Office. The defence was undertaken at the request of the accused and upon the modest funds that could be raised for him by a young barrister of Melbourne named Mr. Alfred Deakin. Mr. Deakin was 35 years old that autumn. He was a tall, slender man with dark hair and a steady brown eye and a soft, carrying voice that could hold a courtroom without effort. He was already a member of the colonial parliament. He had served as chief secretary of the colony. He would, in the years to come, be 3 times Prime Minister of the federated Australian nation, and his face would be set upon the postage stamps of that far country. But in that grey autumn of 1892 he was still a working barrister of the Melbourne bar, and he took his brief in the matter of the Crown against Frederick Bailey Deeming with the quiet, steady care of a man who believed, as his church had taught him, that every accused was owed the plain, honest labour of the man who stood at his side. He came to the cell in Russell Street upon the morning after the arrival at Port Melbourne. He carried a small leather folder under his arm, and a pen, and a bottle of ink, and a sheaf of foolscap. He sat upon a wooden stool in the narrow cell, and the accused sat upon the edge of the iron cot before him, and the small, pale gentleman spoke, in his soft, plausible voice, for nearly 2 hours. He spoke of his childhood in the shires of England. He spoke of his mother, and of the fits that had come upon him in the schoolyard, and of the strange dark thoughts that had crossed his mind in the years of his wandering. He said that he had been mad from his boyhood. He said that his father had been mad before him. He said that he had no memory of the small kitchen in Andrew Street, or of any hand of his upon a trowel or a bag of cement, and that whatever had been done there had been done by a stranger who wore his face. Mr. Deakin wrote it all down in his small, quick hand. He asked no questions until the end. Then he closed his folder and rose and stood a moment at the small barred window with his back to the accused. He said, in his soft carrying voice, that the only defence that could be offered in such a case was a plea of insanity, and that he would do what he could to place it before the jury. He did not in his heart believe that it would succeed. He had read the depositions from Rainhill. He had read the notes of Sergeant Considine. He had read the reports of the 2 colonial doctors who had already examined the accused in his cell, and had written that the man was of sound mind, though of a cold and vain and cunning disposition. But he had taken the brief, and he would do the work. He shook the small, pale hand of the accused once through the grille of the door. Then he walked out through the heavy iron gate of the Gale into the grey afternoon, and he crossed the road to his chambers in Chancery Lane, and he sat down at his desk beneath the tall window and began to write. The trial opened upon the 27th day of April, in the year 1892, in the Criminal Court of the Supreme Court of Victoria, in the old bluestone building in Russell Street. The morning was cold and bright. The autumn leaves lay in yellow drifts along the pavement of the street. A crowd had been gathering since before dawn. By 9 o'clock the queue for the public gallery stretched from the courthouse door around the corner and along Little Burke Street for the space of a full furlong. Women in dark bonnets waited with sandwiches wrapped in brown paper. Clerks in stiff collars smoked short clay pipes and read the Morning Argus, folded small against the wind. Reporters from the London papers, who had come out upon the fast mail steamers to cover the case, stood together in a small knot by the corner, in long ulsters and low soft hats, exchanging in low voices what they had heard in the tap rooms about the town. The name of Whitechapel was in the air, though no one spoke it very loud. The porters of the court opened the gallery doors at 9. The rush upon the narrow stair was such that a woman was carried out fainting within the first minute, and a small boy had his hat crushed, and the doors were closed again with above 100 still outside upon the pavement. The accused was brought up from the cells beneath the courthouse a little before 10. He came into the dock between 2 warders, a short, quick step upon the wooden stair. He was dressed in a plain dark suit that had been brought him for the occasion, with a stiff white collar and a black tie. His hair was combed. His moustache was neatly trimmed. He looked about the crowded court with his light, restless blue eyes, and he lifted a small, pale hand and touched the rail of the dock as if to steady himself, and he smiled once, faintly, at no one in particular. The whisper that ran through the gallery at his coming was such that Mr. Justice Hodges, entering by the small door behind the bench in his scarlet and his full-bottomed wig, was obliged to strike his desk with the flat of his hand and to call for silence before the proceedings could begin. The indictment was read. It charged the accused, Frederick Bailey Deeming, otherwise Albert Oliver Williams, otherwise Baron Swanston, with the wilful murder of Emily Lydia Mather at a cottage in Andrew Street, Windsor, upon or about the 24th day of December in the year 1891. The charges of the killings at Rainhill were not laid in that court, for they were of the jurisdiction of England, and the Crown had elected to try only the Windsor case. The accused was asked how he pleaded. He rose in the dock. He set his hands upon the rail. He said, in a light, clear voice that carried to the back of the gallery, that he was not guilty. Then he sat down again upon the wooden bench and folded his hands upon his knee. The prosecution opened. The evidence was set out in a plain, patient order. The agent from Chapel Street was called. The plumber Hetherington was called. Sergeant Considine was called, and the Dr. Yule, and the neighbour Mrs. Wilkinson from the low iron gate of number 59, and the grocer's boy who had smelled the fresh mortar in the dim passage. The purser of the Norddeutscher Lloyd was called, and he brought his book with the copperplate entry of the second-class passage of Mr. and Mrs. Albert Williams. The carter from Port Melbourne was called. The ironmonger from Chapel Street was called, who had sold the bricklayer's trowel with the beechwood handle and the 2 large bags of Portland cement. Piece by piece the summer heat and the drawn blinds and the small back bedroom and the shawl of grey and rose wool were laid before the jury, and the 12 plain men in the box sat with their hands folded upon the wooden rail and did not stir. Mr. Deakin rose to cross-examine each witness in his soft, carrying voice. He drew from them what he could, a doubt as to identification, a possible confusion of dates, a question as to the source of the cement. He was careful. He was patient. He did not push a witness beyond the point at which the jury would begin to resent him. He knew he was arguing before an audience that had already read the depositions in the morning papers, and that had made up its mind before the doors of the court had opened. He was arguing not for an acquittal, but for a doubt sufficient to found the plea of insanity that he would put before them at the close. The accused sat in the dock through it all. He wrote small notes upon a scrap of paper with a stub of pencil, and passed them down to his counsel by the hand of a warder. He whispered sometimes to himself. He laughed once, softly, at nothing that any other person in the court could see, and Mr. Justice Hodges lifted his grey eyes from his notes and looked at him a long, steady moment, and then looked down again. In the gallery, a lady in a black bonnet crossed herself and pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. The 2 colonial doctors were called upon the 3rd day. They had examined the accused in his cell. They gave it as their opinion, in the plain, careful voices of men who had walked the wards of the asylum at Kew, that Frederick Bailey Deeming was of sound mind within the meaning of the law. They said that he understood the nature and quality of his acts. They said that he understood that those acts were wrong. They said that his boasting and his lying and his fits of laughter did not amount, in the strict sense, to insanity, but only to a hardened vanity and a cold nature. Mr. Deakin cross-examined them for the full afternoon. He put to them the childhood in Ashby, and the fits upon the flagstones, and the mother dead of a winter fever, and the long years of wandering under false names. The doctors held their ground. They said what they had said. They stepped down from the box, and the pale autumn light through the high windows was already turning gold along the panelled wall behind the bench. Mr. Deakin made his address upon the 4th day. He spoke for above 2 hours. He spoke of the strange fixed stare that had come upon Thomas Deeming in his drinking silences, and of the cousin in Derbyshire who had gone the same way, and of the trouble in the blood that had, upon the account of the older brother Alfred, run through the family like a slow, dark river. He spoke of the small boy in the schoolyard behind the National School, alone among the marbles and the hoops, whom the children of Ashby had called Mad Fred. He spoke, in his soft carrying voice, of the mercy that the law had always shown to the man who could not tell the meaning of his own hand. He asked the jury to find, upon the plain facts before them, that the accused had been not a wicked man, but a broken one, and that the law of the colony must set him not upon the gallows, but within the walls of the asylum, where he might live out his years beneath the quiet keeping of a Christian state. The Crown Solicitor rose to reply. He spoke in a plainer manner and for a shorter time. He set before the jury the trowel and the cement and the neat slanting hand upon the passenger book. He set before them the shallow pits at Rainhill and at Windsor, and the folded shawls, and the small brown boots with their laces tied together in a neat bow. He said that these were not the acts of a broken man. He said that they were the acts of a patient and a careful and a cold one, who had known well what he did, and had done it upon a plan. Mr. Justice Hodges summed up upon the 5th morning. He spoke for above 3 hours in his plain, steady voice. He directed the jury upon the law of insanity as it stood in that year, upon the ancient rules from the case of Mr. Macnaughton in the old country some 50 years before. He directed them upon the burden of proof. He directed them upon their duty to the accused, and their duty to the Crown, and their duty above all to the plain honest weighing of the evidence that had been set before them. Then he sent them out. The doors of the jury room closed at 12:30. The gallery did not empty. The reporters did not leave their bench. The accused was taken down to a small cell beneath the court, and a warder brought him a plate of bread and cold beef and a cup of tea. He ate it slowly. He asked the warder, in his soft voice, whether the man thought it would rain again upon the town before the evening. The warder said he did not know. The accused nodded, and set down the cup, and sat a long while upon the wooden bench with his hands folded upon his knee, and his light, restless blue eyes fixed upon the small barred window high in the wall, through which the pale autumn sky of the colony of Victoria could just be seen. The jury came back at a little before 4. The verdict was written upon a folded slip of paper, and the foreman rose in the box and read it in a plain, quiet voice. Guilty of the wilful murder of Emily Lydia Mather, in the cottage at Andrew Street, Windsor, upon the 24th day of December, in the year of our Lord 1891. The whisper that ran through the gallery was very short. The accused stood in the dock. He set his hands upon the rail. He was asked, in the ancient form, whether he had anything to say why the sentence of the court should not be pronounced upon him. He spoke for a little above 5 minutes, in his soft, plausible voice, of a mother in a Leicestershire cottage who had been the sweetest woman that ever lived, and of a lifetime of enemies who had followed him across the seas, and of a mind that had never, he said, been quite his own. Mr. Justice Hodges heard him out in the failing light. Then the judge set upon his grey head the small black square of cloth. He passed the sentence of the court in the old plain words that had not been changed for many years. The accused would be taken from that place to a lawful prison, and thence to a place of execution, and there hanged by the neck until he was dead, and might the Lord God have mercy upon his soul. They took him down at a little after 5. The gallery began to empty in a slow, subdued current toward the wide street. The reporters folded their notes. Mr. Deakin gathered his papers into his leather folder, and sat a long moment at his table beneath the panelled wall, and did not look up. Outside, in Russell Street, the autumn dusk was falling upon the city. A cold, thin rain had begun again upon the roofs. In his cell beneath the court, the small pale gentleman sat upon the wooden bench with his hands folded upon his knee, and he waited for the warder to come and take him back along the covered passage to the gaol, where a quiet cell upon an upper gallery had already been made ready for him, and where, in the far corner of the yard beyond the wall, a plain wooden scaffold stood beneath a pale iron beam, and waited too. The final descent. The night that followed the sentence was very long in the small cell upon the upper gallery of the Melbourne gaol. A single gas jet burned low above the door, and its pale blue flame hissed softly through the quiet hours. He sat upon the edge of the iron cot in his plain grey suit, with his hands folded upon his knee, and he did not sleep. The warder passed once an hour in the passage beyond the grille, and the tread of the heavy boot upon the stone flags was the only sound in the great building, save for the small dry cough of a prisoner in a cell 2 doors along. The rain that had begun in Russell Street at the falling of the dusk did not lift through the night. It ran upon the slate roofs, and it ran in the wide gutters of the yard below, and toward the small hours it settled into a slow, steady drift that would carry through into the dawn. The date of the execution had been fixed by the sheriff of the colony for the 23rd day of May, in the year 1892. The interval between the sentence and the day was short by the usage of that court, no more than 4 weeks, and it was passed in the ordinary way of a condemned cell. He was moved in the first week from the gallery to a smaller cell set apart at the head of the corridor, with an iron door and a heavier grille, and 2 warders were set to watch him by turns through the day and the night. He was given a Bible bound in black cloth. He was given a small stub of pencil and a sheaf of foolscap. He was given a plate of plain food 3 times in the day, a bowl of porridge in the morning, a piece of boiled mutton and a potato at noon, a slice of bread and a mug of tea at evening. He ate a little of each. He did not complain. The chaplain of the gaol came to him upon the 2nd morning. The chaplain was a small, stout clergyman of the Church of England, a Mr. Scott, with a soft voice and a plain, steady manner and a great tenderness for the men in his keeping. He sat upon the wooden stool in the small cell, and he opened the black Bible upon his knee, and he read to the condemned man the 23rd Psalm in the old plain words that had comforted many a soul in that place before him. He asked whether the prisoner would kneel with him at the close of the reading and speak the prayer that our Lord had taught. The prisoner shook his head once. He said, in his soft voice, that his mother had taught him that prayer in a cottage in Leicestershire many years before, and that he did not think he had the right to speak it now. Mr. Scott closed the Bible and set his small, warm hand upon the sleeve of the grey suit. He said that the mercy of God was of another measure than the mercy of men. He came again upon the 3rd morning, and upon the 4th, and upon each morning after that, and by the 2nd week the prisoner would kneel with him at the close of the reading, though he spoke the words very low, and his light, restless blue eyes did not close. He wrote in that time a long paper upon the foolscap that had been given him. It ran to some 50 sheets in his neat slanting hand. It began with the cottage in Ashby-de-la-Zouch, and the forge behind the small brick house, and the soft voice of a mother by the fire. It ran through the long slanting years, the ports and the false names, and the 4 small children that had followed him across the seas. Near the close of it he wrote of Marie in a plain few lines, and of the 4 small graves at Rainhill, and of Emily at Windsor, but he did not confess to any of them. He said only that a stranger who wore his face had done these things, and that he had not been himself. He gave the paper into the hand of Mr. Scott upon the last morning but one. Mr. Scott folded it into the pocket of his cassock. He did not read it in the cell. He read it later in his small study by a lamp, and he sat a long while with it upon his knee, and he closed his eyes, and he did not tell any man what he had found within it. The question of Whitechapel was never asked of him in the plain words of the court. The reporters of the London papers had written of it in their columns for many weeks. The keepers of the taverns in the streets about Russell Street had spoken of it in the low tones of men who wished to be heard but not quoted. The name of Jack the Ripper had been set beside the name of Frederick Deeming in the papers of a dozen capitals of Europe. But no witness had come forward from Whitechapel who could place him in the fog of Bucks Row, or of Hanbury Street, or of Mitre Square in the autumn of 1888. His movements in that year were not clearly known. He had been at sea, or in a lodging in Cape Town, or in a hotel in Antwerp, or in a small room off Mount Pleasant in Liverpool. The record was thin, and much of it was in his own hand. Mr. Scott asked him once, upon the evening before the last, in the soft voice of a chaplain and not of a magistrate, whether there was any other matter that lay upon his conscience beyond what had been set down in the paper. The prisoner sat a long moment upon the edge of the iron cot with his eyes upon the small barred window. Then he said, in his soft voice, that there were things that no man would ever know. He said no more. The chaplain did not press him. It was not the office of a chaplain to press. The morning of the 23rd of May came grey and cold upon the city. A raw wind blew from the south across the bay and up the narrow streets, and a thin mist lay upon the roofs of the town. A crowd had gathered along Russell Street from before the first light. The high walls of the gaol rose black above the pavement, and the small crowd stood in their long coats and their dark bonnets and their soft felt hats, and they did not speak much among themselves. A woman had brought a small posy of white flowers wrapped in a scrap of newspaper, and she stood at the far corner and looked up at the walls and she did not know herself for whom the flowers were meant. Two mounted troopers sat upon their horses at the head of the street to keep the pavement clear. The bell of the Roman chapel a little way along began to ring the 8 o'clock hour. Within the gaol, the passage from the condemned cell to the scaffold was some 40 paces along a covered walk. He rose from the iron cot at a little before 7. He washed his face and his hands in the tin basin that had been set for him. He combed his hair with a small horn comb. He put on the plain dark suit that had been brought him for the day, and the stiff white collar and the black tie. He drank half a mug of tea. He ate nothing. Mr. Scott sat with him upon the wooden stool. They read together the 51st Psalm, the old plain words of the penitent king, and the prisoner spoke the responses in his soft voice, and his hands were folded quietly upon his knee. The sheriff of the colony came to the door of the cell at a little before 8. He was a grave man in a long dark coat and a silk hat. Behind him stood the governor of the gaol and 2 warders, and the executioner, a plain, heavy-shouldered man in a working coat and a soft cap. The sheriff read the warrant of the court in a plain voice. The prisoner stood in the middle of the cell to hear it. He set his hands together before him. When the reading was done, he bowed his head once. The executioner stepped forward and buckled the leather strap about his wrists behind his back. The strap was drawn firm but not cruel. He did not resist. They went out of the cell in a small, quiet procession. The sheriff first, then the governor, then the chaplain reading softly from the burial service in his black cassock, then the prisoner between 2 warders with the executioner at their back. The passage was of dressed bluestone, and the walk was covered with a low tarred roof. The morning air was cold within it. Their footfalls rang together upon the flags. The prisoner walked with a steady step. His face was pale. His light, restless blue eyes were lowered to the ground. He did not stumble. He did not speak. In the yard beyond the passage, the wooden scaffold stood beneath its pale iron beam, and a plain hemp rope hung from it, and beneath the rope the trap-door of oiled pine boards was set flush into the platform. A small knot of witnesses stood at the rail below, the doctor of the gaol, a justice of the peace, 3 reporters with their notebooks, and the little grey figure of Mr. Alfred Deakin, who had come alone in a plain coat, and who stood with his hat held against his breast. The prisoner climbed the 12 steps of the scaffold between his 2 warders. He stood upon the trap. The executioner buckled the strap about his ankles and drew a white cotton cap down over his head. The chaplain spoke the words of committal in his soft voice. The rope was set about the neck, and the knot was drawn behind the ear. The sheriff raised his hand once, quickly. The bolt was drawn. The bell of the Roman chapel along the street was still tolling the hour. In the street below, the woman with the small posy of white flowers held them a little tighter against her breast. Mr. Deakin closed his eyes for the length of a breath, and then he opened them again, and he set his hat back upon his head. The doctor stepped forward and set his hand against the wrist. He waited. He set his ear against the breast. He straightened at last and nodded once to the sheriff. The sheriff wrote the time in a small black book that he carried in his coat. The clock upon the wall of the gaol yard stood at 3 minutes past 8. Frederick Bailey Deeming, sometime of Ashby-de-la-Zouch, sometime of Sydney and Cape Town and Rainhill and Windsor, sometime Druin and Williams and Swanston and Lawson and Barron, was dead. They took him down within the hour. He was buried that same afternoon in the plain manner of the colony, in a shallow grave within the walls of the gaol, in an unmarked plot beside the wall of the western yard. A small pine box, a shovelful of the black Melbourne earth, a plain white cross of no name for the space of a year, and then not even that. The rain that had drifted through the morning began again as the earth was turned. Mr. Scott spoke the last words of the service in his soft voice above the grave. The 2 warders stood with their caps in their hands. The plaster of the wall behind them was streaked dark with the wet. The trowel that had been carried from an ironmonger's lane in Byrom Street in Liverpool and used upon a hearthstone at Rainhill and packed in a scrap of sacking in a leather trunk and carried across the great southern ocean and used again upon a hearthstone at Windsor and set at last upon a shelf above a black iron range in a small, quiet kitchen in Andrew Street. The trowel was kept for many years in a glass case in the Melbourne Museum, with a small printed card beside it, until at last the years wore the card away, and the trowel was set into a drawer, with other things of its age, and forgotten. The bag of cement was thrown upon the rubbish tip behind the jail. The neat slanting hand upon the passenger books and the parish registers and the 50 sheets of foolscap in Mr. Scott's study passed into the yellowing files of the courts and the offices of the shipping lines, and slept there through the turning of the century. In a small green plot in the churchyard of St. Bartholomew at Rainhill, 5 graves were made in the autumn of that same year. Emily Lydia Mather was laid nearest the wall. Beside her, in a single grave, lay Marie Deeming and her 4 small children, Bertha and small Marie and Sydney and Liala, whom her mother, in her heart, had called Lily. The stone was of plain grey granite, cut simply, with the names in a plain Roman letter and the dates below. Mrs. Mather went to the plot upon the first Sunday of every month for the rest of her life. She carried a small posy of white asters in the summer, and a spray of holly in the winter, and she stood a long while by the wall in the still Lancashire afternoons, and did not weep, for she had wept all her weeping in a horsehair sofa in a parlour beneath a framed print of the Good Shepherd, in the long grey afternoon when a sergeant named Kinsman had come to her door. In the cottage in Ashby-de-la-Zouch, a small brass Buddha that a boy had once brought home from a bazaar in Calcutta was set upon a shelf above a range and dusted upon a Saturday morning by an older sister for the space of some years, and then it too was set into a drawer, and then it was given away to a cousin, and then it was lost. The forge behind the cottage cooled at last. The name of the family passed slowly from the market square. In the parish book, the entry of the 7th child of Thomas and Anne Deeming stood untouched, in the careful hand of a curate who had been long dead, Frederick Bailey Deeming, baptised in the parish church, upon a summer morning in the middle of the century. And the question that the papers had asked in a dozen capitals of Europe, in the small print beside the black-ruled columns of the spring of 1892, was never answered. Whether the neat, patient hand that had smoothed the mortar upon a hearthstone at Windsor had once moved through the fog of Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888, whether the small, pale gentleman in the black felt hat had walked in the shadow of the gas lamps of Bucks Row, and of Hanbury Street, and of Mitre Square, whether the same slanting mind that had folded a shawl of grey and rose wool across the face of a young Lancashire wife had also drawn a knife in the yellow fog above the east end of an older city. No witness came forward, and no letter was found, and no confession was set down in any hand that could be trusted. The question passed into the long, slow rumour of the years. It passed from the columns of the papers to the pages of the books, and from the books to the whispered talk of the bookstalls, and from the whispered talk to the small quiet places where old questions go when the world has grown tired of asking them. And now the room where this story has been told grows still. The wind has fallen at the window. The rain, if it was ever there, has drifted away toward the sea. Wherever the listener has been resting through these long, slow hours, in a warm bed by a window, or a chair beneath a lamp, or a room where the small dark of the small hours has folded softly upon the walls, a kind farewell is offered here. The gale in Russell Street is gone. The cottage in Andrew Street is gone. The villa at the end of Lawton Road is gone. Only the plain grey stone in the churchyard at Rainhill remains, and the names cut into it, and the small white asters that a mother laid there upon the first Sunday of every month, until at last her own name was cut beside them, and the plot fell quiet, and the starlings went on wheeling above the church tower, as they had wheeled in the summer that the doors of Dinham Villa had first been drawn shut. The candle burned low. The chamber fell silent, and history once again turned the page in the dark,